Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story.
Low jazz floated softly across the private dining room, mixing with the sound of expensive silverware and quiet conversations that felt more forced than relaxed. The restaurant sat high above downtown Dallas, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass windows that overlooked the city lights below. Everything inside the room screamed money, without needing to say it out loud. Crystal wine glasses, tailored suits, designer dresses, fake laughter, businessmen trying too hard to sound important, women smiling through marriages that looked polished from far away and exhausted up close. At the center of the room sat a long, candle-lit table reserved for one of the city's most influential real estate networking dinners. The kind of dinner where reputations mattered almost as much as bank accounts. Nobody there expected drama, especially not this kind. A server stepped carefully between tables carrying another bottle of wine when the elevator doors finally opened near the entrance. The timing alone made several people glance over. Mark always liked arriving late, not late enough to look careless, late enough to be noticed, and tonight, he definitely wanted to be noticed. The conversations around the room softened almost immediately as he walked in. Tall, tailored, black suit, expensive watch catching the restaurant lights every time he moved his hand. That confident smile he wore whenever he entered a room full of people he wanted approval from. But nobody focused on Mark for very long, because the woman beside him changed the entire atmosphere in seconds. Young, beautiful, polished in the kind of way that came from social media tutorials and expensive shopping trips. Her black dress hugged her body carefully, elegant enough for the restaurant but still designed to attract attention. She stayed close to Mark's arm as they walked inside, trying to appear confident even while quietly studying the room. At first, a few guests smiled automatically. Then realization hit that wasn't Sharon. For a second, the room lost rhythm. Even the jazz music suddenly felt awkward. One woman near the end of the table stopped lifting her wine glass halfway to her mouth. Another guest quickly looked down at his phone to avoid reacting too openly. A businessman sitting beside his wife cleared his throat and adjusted in his chair. Nobody wanted to be the first person to acknowledge what everybody already understood. Mark brought another woman to a dinner where his wife was already seated. Honestly, that should have been the moment he turned around and left. But Mark kept walking like he had just made the greatest entrance of his life, because in his mind, this was power. Attention meant power. Shock meant power. People staring meant power. And deep down, Mark had become addicted to feeling admired, even if admiration lasted only a few seconds. The young woman beside him leaned closer and whispered carefully, "Why does everybody look so uncomfortable?" Mark smirked without slowing down. "They'll survive." He said it casually, too casually, like he had rehearsed the confidence before arriving. But confidence and peace are not the same thing, and Mark was nowhere near peaceful. A few people finally stood to greet him politely, though their smiles looked painfully tight now. "Mark," one man said slowly, "good to see you." Mark shook his hand firmly. "Always good seeing you too." The young woman smiled beside him, but her eyes kept moving around the room, noticing things she didn't fully understand yet. The silence felt heavier with every step toward the table. Nobody mentioned Sharon directly. Nobody had to, because she was already there, sitting halfway down the candlelit table in a dark emerald dress that fit her with quiet elegance. No dramatic expression, no broken posture, no tears. Sharon simply looked up as Mark approached, calm, composed, one hand resting lightly beside her wineglass. The soft candlelight reflected gently against her skin, while diamond earrings shimmered each time she moved her head slightly. And somehow, that calmness made the situation far more uncomfortable. If Sharon had screamed, people could have blamed emotion. If Sharon had cried, people could have focused on pity. But this felt different, dangerously different, because Sharon looked like a woman who had already accepted something painful long before tonight. Mark slowed slightly once their eyes met, just slightly, barely noticeable. But Sharon noticed. She always noticed the small changes in him, even years ago, back when his smiles were real. The young woman beside him finally spoke softly. "Oh." That single word carried sudden realization. She understood now, not fully, but enough. Mark pulled out the chair beside him anyway, still pretending control, still pretending the room admired him. "Everybody," Mark announced with a smile too polished to feel natural. "Hope we're not too late." Nobody answered immediately. The server standing nearby looked trapped between professional training and human discomfort. One woman forced a small laugh that disappeared almost instantly. A man near the opposite side of the table suddenly became very interested in the breadbasket. Sharon looked at Mark for another quiet second before offering a polite smile to the younger woman. Not fake, not overly warm, just controlled. "Good evening," Sharon said gently. That almost made the situation worse. The young woman nodded quickly. "Hi." She looked toward Mark again, uncertain now, probably wondering why the wife looked calmer than the husband. Mark loosened his jaw slightly. He expected anger, expected confrontation, expected Sharon to break emotionally. Instead, she remained perfectly still, and people around the table were beginning to notice who actually looked uncomfortable. It wasn't Sharon. It was Mark. A waiter finally approached carefully with menus, trying to rescue the atmosphere. But tension had already settled across the room, like invisible pressure. Nobody could relax now. Not after this. Mark reached for his wine glass. Almost immediately, his confidence remained on the surface. But tiny cracks had already started underneath, because deep down, he hated silence. And Sharon's silence was becoming impossible to control. She glanced once toward the younger woman again, not judgmental, not cruel, just observant. That somehow carried more weight than anger ever could. The young woman shifted slightly in her chair under Sharon's calm gaze. Mark noticed, for the first time that night, his chest tightened. Only a little, but enough to warn him something was going wrong. And the worst part? Nobody at that table felt impressed. Not even the men who secretly lived for gossip. People weren't looking at Mark with envy. They were looking at Sharon with sympathy. Mark still hadn't realized that yet, but he was about to, and once he understood it, the regret would hit harder than humiliation ever could. If you've ever watched somebody destroy their own relationship because of ego, go ahead and hit like. Stories like this happen more often than people admit. Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button, because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. The waiter finished pouring wine into Sharon's glass first. Not intentionally, just instinct. Maybe because she looked like the only steady person at the table. Mark noticed it anyway. His jaw tightened for half a second before he forced another smile and leaned back into his chair like nothing about tonight bothered him. But the energy around the table had already changed beyond repair. Nobody reached for the menu. Nobody cared about the food anymore. A woman sitting across from Sharon attempted a weak smile. "So, how's everybody been lately?" The question floated awkwardly across the table before dying almost immediately. Nobody knew how to answer, because everybody was thinking the same thing. What exactly did Mark expect to happen tonight? The younger woman beside him folded her hands carefully in her lap now. Earlier, she had walked into the restaurant holding his arm confidently. That confidence was fading fast, especially every time she looked toward Sharon. Because Sharon wasn't behaving like a woman fighting for her husband. She was behaving like someone quietly watching a building burn after already removing everything valuable from inside. And that scared people. Mark reached for his wine again. Big mistake. His hand moved too quickly and lightly tapped the base of the glass before gripping it properly. Tiny moment. Most people ignored it. Sharon noticed. She always noticed nervous habits. Years ago, Mark used to do the same thing. Before difficult business meetings. Before loan approvals. Before speaking at large events. Back when she still helped calm him down afterward. That memory crossed her face for only a second before disappearing again. The businessman sitting near the center of the table finally cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered awkwardly. "Dallas traffic's been terrible lately." A few people gave polite little laughs. The kind people use when they desperately want tension to disappear. Mark jumped into the opening immediately. "Tell me about it," he said, forcing confidence back into his voice. "We almost got stuck near downtown." The younger woman nodded quickly beside him. "Yeah, it was crazy." Silence again. Not complete silence, but the kind filled with thoughts nobody wanted to say aloud. One woman glanced briefly toward Sharon, probably waiting for an explosion, maybe tears, maybe rage. Instead, Sharon calmly lifted her wine glass and took a slow sip without breaking composure. That calmness was beginning to suffocate Mark more than yelling ever could, because now he looked like the only emotionally reckless person in the room. The younger woman shifted in her seat again. "You have a beautiful dress," she said suddenly to Sharon, trying to ease the discomfort. And for the first time that night, Sharon smiled genuinely, not because she felt happy, because she understood exactly what was happening now. The younger woman was uncomfortable too. "Thank you," Sharon replied softly. "That's kind of you." Mark exhaled quietly through his nose. He hated how calm Sharon sounded, hated how impossible she was making this moment. Because the truth was ugly, he brought another woman here, hoping for emotional chaos. He wanted Sharon hurt, visibly, wanted people shocked, wanted attention, wanted to feel powerful. Instead, every passing second made him feel smaller. One of the older businessmen finally leaned toward Mark slightly. "Sharon helped organize most of tonight's event," he said carefully. "She did a great job." Mark nodded once. "Yeah. She's always been good at this kind of thing." "Always been, not is." Sharon caught that immediately. So did two other women at the table. Words matter during emotional distance. Small changes expose bigger truths. The younger woman looked between them quietly now, listening harder, probably realizing this relationship carried history she couldn't compete with. Because Sharon and Mark didn't look like strangers. They looked like two people carrying years inside their silence. A server arrived with appetizers, grateful for something practical to focus on. Plates touched the table carefully. Silverware shifted softly. Nobody really ate. Mark tried pulling the conversation toward business, new housing developments, property investments, golf invitations, anything except the obvious emotional disaster sitting directly beside him. For a few minutes, people played along, but tension kept returning, especially every time Sharon spoke calmly to someone else at the table. She laughed once at a small joke from another guest, not loudly, just naturally and honestly. That laugh hit Mark harder than anger would have, because it reminded him of home, late-night kitchen dancing, road trips across Texas, cheap wine, in tiny hotel rooms years ago, before money complicated everything. For one quick second, his chest felt painfully tight. The younger woman beside him touched his arm lightly. "You okay?" Mark blinked quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine." But he wasn't, not anymore, because something dangerous was happening inside that room. People were beginning to remember who Sharon had always been to him. Not just a wife, foundation, support, history. The woman who stood beside him before success made him arrogant enough to mistake attention for love, and Mark could feel respect shifting away from him with every passing minute. The older woman near Sharon finally spoke carefully. "You always host beautifully, Sharon." Another soft smile. "Thank you." Then Sharon placed her wine glass down gently beside her plate. No dramatic movement, no emotional performance. Still calm, still terrifyingly calm. When she finally looked toward Mark fully again, even the younger woman beside him straightened slightly, because the temperature of the room seemed to change without warning. Sharon folded her hands together lightly. "You know," she said softly, "there was a time Mark used to hate events like this." Mark's face shifted immediately, subtle but visible. A few guests looked toward him. Sharon continued gently. "He used to get nervous before every major dinner meeting." A tiny smile touched her lips, especially when his company was struggling. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody dared. He'd sit in the car beforehand, pretending to check emails, Sharon said quietly. But really, he was trying to calm himself down. Mark swallowed once. The younger woman slowly removed her hand from his arm. Sharon wasn't attacking him. That made it worse, because truth delivered calmly cuts deeper. "I remember helping decorate his very first office," Sharon continued. "Back when we couldn't afford half the things people think we've always had." A businessman across the table lowered his eyes slightly. Sharon noticed. So did Mark. "He almost lost everything during the housing crash," she added gently. "Most people here probably don't know that. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But we survived it together." That word landed heavily. Together. The younger woman stared down at her folded hands now. Mark shifted in his chair. His confidence was disappearing piece by piece, not because Sharon embarrassed him loudly, because she reminded everybody who helped build him before success changed him. And suddenly, his expensive watch looked meaningless. His tailored suit looked meaningless. Even the younger woman beside him suddenly looked less like status and more like evidence of insecurity. Sharon tilted her head slightly before speaking again. You learn something interesting about people when they become afraid of aging. The room became painfully still. Mark's face tightened instantly. Nobody touched their food anymore. Some people start chasing attention, Sharon said softly. Not because they're happy, because they're terrified. Mark stared at her now. Actually stared, because for the first time that evening, he realized Sharon wasn't emotionally reacting tonight. She had already emotionally processed this pain long ago, and that terrified him. Then Sharon looked directly at him and delivered the sentence that crushed whatever confidence he still had left. A man who humiliates a loyal woman in public usually discovers too late what loyalty was worth. Silence. Real silence. Even the jazz music in the background suddenly felt distant. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed comfortably. The younger woman looked completely frozen beside Mark now. And Mark, for the first time that night, his confidence cracked openly, not dramatically, but visibly enough for everybody at the table to see it happen. Because deep down he knew something awful in that moment. Sharon was no longer fighting to keep him. She was letting him lose her. And suddenly, that felt far more dangerous than anger ever could. 3 years earlier. The Houston heat wrapped around the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, thick with barbecue smoke, music, and the kind of laughter that traveled across front yards before sunset even finished settling in. Mark regretted wearing the boots almost immediately, not because they were uncomfortable, because Sharon had laughed at him for them twice already. You look like a divorced country singer trying to win custody of a motorcycle, she said, while climbing out of the passenger seat. Mark looked down at the polished brown leather boots. These cost $800. That makes it worse. She shut the car door, smiling. Mark stared at her for a second, before shaking his head under his breath. That was becoming dangerous. The way she could roast him without sounding mean. Most women around Mark either tried too hard to impress him or agreed with everything he said before he even finished talking. Sharon did neither, and honestly, he liked that more than he wanted to admit. Music blasted from the backyard behind her mother's house, while relatives moved around carrying trays of food, folding chairs, coolers, and paper plates, balanced dangerously in one hand. The smell alone nearly distracted Mark completely. Barbecue ribs, charcoal smoke, sweet baked beans, something fried, something spicy, and something buttery enough to make his expensive Dallas steakhouse dinners suddenly feel pointless. You nervous? Sharon asked, while adjusting the earrings hanging beneath her curls. Mark scoffed softly. I own 3 companies. That's not what I asked. She started walking toward the backyard gate. Mark followed behind her, carrying the peach cobbler she told him not to buy from an expensive bakery because, according to her, black families don't trust desserts from places with glass walls and jazz music. He still wasn't fully sure what that meant. The moment they entered the backyard, the energy hit him all at once. People everywhere. Kids running across the grass screaming at each other. Music loud enough to shake the patio windows. An older man arguing passionately near the grill about football. Women laughing so hard near the folding tables one nearly dropped her drink. And right in the middle of it all, Sharon somehow belonged perfectly. She greeted people naturally, without changing herself. Hug here, smile there, quick joke, quick laugh. Mark watched her move through the cookout like warmth followed her automatically. It fascinated him, a little too much. There she is, one older woman shouted immediately. About time you got here. Then her eyes landed directly on Mark. The entire expression changed, not hostile, interested. Oh, she said slowly. So this him? Sharon groaned instantly. Please don't start. Too late. 3 more women nearby already turned toward them with matching curiosity. Mark suddenly felt like a teenager meeting parents for the first time. One auntie stepped forward first, eyeing Mark carefully from head to toe. Well, she announced loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear, he definitely moisturizes. The entire table burst into laughter. Even Mark laughed, mostly because Sharon almost choked, trying not to. Oh my God, she muttered, covering her face. Another auntie leaned closer toward Sharon dramatically. "He look expensive." Mark opened his mouth. Sharon pointed at him immediately. "Don't answer that. I was just gonna say thank you." That made the women laugh harder. One of them grabbed Mark's arm playfully. "You got money, baby?" Sharon sighed. "See? This is why I should have left y'all blocked." Mark surprised himself by answering comfortably. "I think I'm doing okay." The auntie replied, suspiciously. "That sound like rich people language." More laughter. Sharon shook her head, smiling, while pulling Mark toward the food tables. "Come on before they adopt you. You warned me your family was loud." Mark muttered quietly beside her. "We're not loud." A child sprinted past them, screaming at full volume. Sharon paused. "Okay, maybe a little." Mark laughed, before realizing something strange. He felt relaxed, actually relaxed. No business performance, no networking voice, no pretending, just present. That feeling had become rare lately. A younger cousin walked up holding a basketball under one arm. "You the rich, white boyfriend?" Sharon gasped. "Marcus." "What?" The boy asked innocently. "That's what Auntie Denise called him." Mark nearly laughed again. Sharon pointed toward the house dramatically. "You got 5 seconds to disappear." The boy ran off grinning. Mark looked at Sharon carefully. "You threatening children now?" "Only the honest ones." He laughed harder than he expected to, and Sharon noticed, not the laugh itself, the release behind it. Mark usually carried tension, even while smiling. Like part of him stayed mentally somewhere else all the time. Business, pressure, expectations. But here, that pressure kept slipping off him piece by piece. One of the older men at the grill waved Mark over. "You know anything about real barbecue? Or y'all just got salads in Dallas now?" Mark walked toward him, smiling. "Depends who's cooking." "Oh, he got jokes," the man replied immediately. Within minutes, Mark somehow found himself standing beside the grill, discussing brisket temperatures, like he'd known these people for years. Sharon watched quietly from across the yard while filling cups with ice. A soft smile pulled at her lips. Most men she dated before either became uncomfortable around her family or tried too hard to impress them. Mark wasn't doing either. He looked awkward sometimes, but genuine. That mattered more. Her mother stepped beside her quietly. "He watches you a lot." Sharon glanced toward Mark near the grill again. "Who?" "Girl, please." Her mother sipped lemonade calmly. "That man look at you like he finally sat down somewhere peaceful." Sharon didn't answer immediately, because honestly, she had noticed it too, especially during quieter moments. Late phone calls, long drives, conversations that somehow lasted until 2 in the morning without either of them noticing time. Mark listened when she spoke. Really listened. Not politely, not performatively. Like her thoughts actually mattered to him. That was rare, especially from a man raised around money and status. Across the yard, Mark accepted a paper plate overloaded with food. The older man at the grill pointed at him. "Don't embarrass yourself with that hot sauce now. I'll survive." White people always say that right before sweating through their shirt. Mark laughed. 10 seconds later, he tried the sauce. Bad decision. His face tightened instantly, while everybody nearby exploded laughing. "Oh yeah," one auntie yelled. "He fighting demons now." Mark coughed once, reaching quickly for his drink, while Sharon laughed so hard she had to lean against the table. "You okay?" She managed between laughs. Mark pointed toward the sauce container. "Why would anybody make this?" "Because joy matters." He stared at her. "You enjoy suffering. A little." Their eyes held for a second longer than normal. Not dramatic, not movie perfect, just warm, easy, real. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt something unfamiliar settle quietly inside him. Peace, not excitement, not ego, not attention, peace. The music shifted to an older, slow song near the patio speakers, while people continued talking over each other around the backyard. One older couple started dancing casually near the grass. Sharon smiled, watching them. Mark noticed immediately. "You dance?" he asked. Sharon looked back at him suspiciously. "That depends. On what?" "How embarrassing you are." Mark held a hand against his chest. "I'm offended. You should be nervous." But she still took his hand. And while laughter, music, smoke, and summer heat filled the backyard around them, Mark realized something quietly terrifying. Money had impressed people. Success had attracted people. But Sharon made him feel understood. And deep down, that meant more than anything he owned. By the third road trip, Sharon stopped asking where they were going. Not because she didn't care, because Mark never fully knew either. That became part of the fun. Sometimes they ended up outside Austin eating barbecue from roadside places with broken signs and plastic chairs. Other times, they drove hours into small Texas towns where old gas stations still sold cassette tapes beside beef jerky and lottery tickets. Mark called it clearing his head. Sharon called it rich man wandering. "You know, normal people just go to therapy," she told him one Friday night, while their truck rolled through a dark stretch of highway outside Waco. Mark kept one hand on the steering wheel, while old country music played softly through the speaker. "This is cheaper." She stared at him slowly. "You drive a $90,000 truck. Okay, this is more fun." Sharon laughed quietly and leaned her head against the window. Outside, Texas stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. Open roads, scattered lights in the distance, empty fields disappearing into darkness. Mark loved driving at night. No meetings, no phones ringing, no employees asking questions, no father calling to lecture him about expansion opportunities or profit margins. Just road, silence, and Sharon beside him. That last part mattered more than he admitted aloud. He glanced toward her briefly. "You hungry?" "I'm always hungry." "That sounds medically concerning." "Your personality is medically concerning." He smiled to himself. There it was again. That ease she pulled out of him naturally, the kind that didn't exist around anyone else. About 20 minutes later, they stopped at a tiny roadside diner glowing beneath a flickering neon sign. Half the parking lot was filled with pickup trucks, coated in dust. Inside smelled like coffee, fried food, syrup, and old leather booths. A waitress somewhere near the kitchen yelled an order loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. Sharon slid into the booth first, while studying the menu. "Everything here looks aggressively unhealthy." Mark sat across from her. "That's how you know it's good." A tired-looking older waitress approached carrying coffee pots. "You two married?" Mark almost answered immediately. Sharon beat him to it. "No." The waitress nodded calmly. "You got another 6 months before he starts getting on your nerves permanently." Mark looked offended. "Only 6? Baby, you got expensive watch energy. Y'all always become stressful. Eventually." Sharon nearly folded into laughter against the table. Mark stared at the waitress. "What does that even mean?" The waitress pointed at his wrist. "That watch. More than my car." "Fair point." She walked away before he could respond. Sharon wiped tears from her eyes, laughing. "Oh." She read you immediately. "I'm being attacked in this establishment." "No," Sharon corrected. "You're being humbled." Mark shook his head, smiling. That happened often around Sharon. Not humiliation, perspective. She never treated him like his money made him more important than anybody else. At first that frustrated him a little, then it became addictive. Because around Sharon he never felt like a walking bank account. He felt like a person. The waitress returned with coffee. Sharon took one sip and winced dramatically. "This coffee tastes like unemployment." Mark laughed loud enough for 2 people nearby to glance over. "You say things that don't make sense, and yet you keep driving me around Texas." That smile returned again. The real one. Not the business event smile. Not the networking smile. Not the polished smile investors expected. Just Mark. Sharon noticed the difference more every trip, especially during quieter moments. Like later that night when they checked into a small motel outside San Antonio, because heavy rain made the roads difficult to see. The motel room looked straight out of another decade. Old floral curtains, tiny television, weak air conditioning, fighting for its life. Mark stood near the doorway, staring around slowly. "This feels illegal." Sharon tossed her bag onto the bed. "You're spoiled." "I prefer successful." You almost called room service at a hotel that barely had walls. They had options. They had crackers in a vending machine. Mark loosened his jacket, smiling, while thunder rolled outside. Rain tapped steadily against the windows now. Sharon kicked off her shoes before turning toward him. "You know what your problem is?" Mark sat carefully at the edge of the bed. "This should be interesting. You've spent your whole life trying to look impressive." He smirked lightly. "I am impressive. You're also exhausted." That answer sat between them quietly, not dramatic, not accusatory, just true. Mark looked down briefly at his hands. The expensive watch, the tailored clothes, the constant pressure to succeed harder every year. Even now, at 36, he still felt like he was chasing approval from men who barely hugged their sons growing up. That obvious?" he asked eventually. Sharon softened immediately. A little thunder echoed again outside. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Sharon walked toward the old radio near the dresser and turned the dial slowly until music crackled softly through static. Country music. Mark looked horrified. "You complain about my music taste, then willingly play this? I'm trying to understand white culture. That's offensive. You own cowboy boots. They're Italian." That, somehow, made it worse. Mark laughed under his breath, while Sharon stepped closer toward him, swaying slightly to the music. "You dancing or judging me tonight?" she asked. "I can multitask." She held out her hand anyway. Mark stared at it for a second before standing. The room was small enough that they kept bumping into furniture, while dancing slowly across the faded carpet. At one point, Sharon accidentally stepped on his boot. "That's revenge for the music comment," Mark said. "No, that was free." Rain continued falling outside, while the cheap motel lamp cast soft golden light across the room. And somewhere between the laughter and clumsy dancing, something shifted emotionally again. Not excitement, not obsession, comfort. The dangerous kind. The kind that makes somebody start imagining permanence, without meaning to. Sharon rested her head lightly against his chest, while they swayed, slowly. "You're thinking too hard again," she murmured. Mark blinked. "How do you know? Your jaw does this thing." "What thing?" She tightened her face dramatically, trying to imitate him. Mark burst out laughing. "I do not look like that." "You absolutely do." He shook his head, smiling before growing quieter again. The music continued softly between them. "You ever get scared?" he asked suddenly. "About what?" "Turning into your parents." Sharon looked up slightly. The humor faded from his voice now. Mark rarely talked about his father directly. When he did, something colder entered the conversation. "My father built everything around appearances," he admitted quietly. "Money, status, business, country clubs." He exhaled slowly. He cared more about looking successful than actually being happy. Sharon listened without interrupting. "He used to tell me, emotions make men weak," Mark continued. "If something bothered you, you worked harder instead of talking about it." "That sounds lonely." It was. The honesty surprised even him. Mark usually avoided conversations like this, even with friends. Especially with friends. But Sharon had this way of making silence feel safe instead of uncomfortable. "That's why you stay busy all the time," she said gently. Mark nodded once. "If I slow down too much." He paused briefly. "I start hearing things I probably don't want to think about." Sharon studied him carefully, not judging, not trying to fix him immediately, just understanding him. And honestly, that almost hurt more, because nobody had looked at Mark that carefully in years. Not beyond the business version of him. Not beyond the confident version. Not beyond the expensive suits and polished image. Sharon touched his face lightly. "You know you don't always have to perform around me, right?" That sentence stayed with him longer than she realized. Even after they stopped dancing. Even after the storm passed. Even later, while they sat cross-legged on the motel bed, eating terrible pie from the diner next door. Mark watched Sharon laughing at something on television, and suddenly felt something tighten painfully in his chest. Fear. Not fear of losing business. Not fear of failure. Fear of needing someone this much. Because Sharon knew things about him nobody else cared enough to notice. The restless nights. The pressure. The insecurity underneath confidence. The boy still trying to impress emotionally distant men. She saw all of it, and somehow still looked at him warmly afterward. Hours later, long after the television went quiet, Mark lay awake staring at the ceiling while Sharon rested beside him. The room smelled faintly like rain and coffee. Outside, trucks occasionally passed along the highway. Sharon shifted slightly closer in her sleep. Without thinking, Mark smiled. Then softly, almost too quietly to hear himself, he whispered the truth he hadn't admitted to anybody before. "You make me forget who everybody expects me to be." The first office Mark ever owned barely looked like the headquarters of a future real estate company. The carpet was uneven. The walls carried old nail holes from whoever rented the place before him. One ceiling light flickered whenever the air conditioning turned on, and the coffee machine near the corner sounded like it was fighting for survival every morning. Mark stood near the doorway holding 2 paint samples, while Sharon walked slowly through the empty space, studying everything carefully. "You hate both colors," he guessed. Sharon looked at him over her shoulder. "The fact you can tell means I'm changing you. I've always had taste. You own silver crocodile boots. They were limited edition. That should have stayed limited. Mark laughed quietly while she continued walking around the office. Most people only saw potential in Mark. Sharon saw pressure too, especially lately. His company was still small back then, successful enough to survive, unstable enough to keep him awake at night. Every deal mattered. Every investor mattered. Every mistake felt expensive. She noticed the tension in him immediately. Whenever money became uncertain, longer silences, less sleep, more pacing. Mark tried hiding stress through control, but Sharon had already learned how to read him beyond words. She stopped beside the large front window and pointed. Your desk should go there. Mark frowned slightly. Not in the back office. No, why not? Because when clients walk in, they need to feel your energy immediately. He folded his arms. My energy? You know what I mean. Mark watched her continue visualizing the space out loud. Plants near the entrance, warmer lighting, artwork that looked modern without trying too hard, furniture that felt welcoming instead of cold. Honestly, half the things Sharon noticed would never have crossed his mind. To Mark, offices were functional. To Sharon, spaces carried emotion. That difference fascinated him. You really think this place can become something? He asked quietly. Sharon looked at him like the question itself annoyed her. Mark? What? You already became something. The room went still for a second, not physically, emotionally, because deep down Mark still measured himself by future success instead of present accomplishments. Nothing ever felt enough yet, not to him. Sharon walked back toward him and took the paint samples from his hand. You know what your problem is? Mark sighed dramatically. This conversation again. You think peace comes after achievement, and you think peace comes from throw pillows and candles. They help. He smiled, then sighed again. He paused briefly. I don't want to fail. The honesty came out rougher than intended. Sharon's expression softened immediately. You won't. You don't know that. I know you. That answer hit harder than encouragement ever could. Because Sharon didn't speak like somebody trying to flatter him. She spoke like somebody paying attention. That mattered a lot, especially to a man raised around people who mostly valued results. Over the next few weeks, Sharon practically transformed the office herself, not because Mark asked, because she cared. She spent evenings helping choose furniture while sitting cross-legged on his living room floor, surrounded by design catalogs and takeout containers. Sometimes they argued playfully over ridiculous details. No, Sharon said firmly one night. That chair looks like a rich villain would pet a cat in it. Mark stared at the photo. It's Italian leather. It's emotionally suspicious. That's not a real thing. It absolutely is. Another time she caught him trying to buy an absurdly expensive sculpture for the lobby. Why does this cost $12,000? It's art. It's a twisted metal triangle. It symbolizes ambition. It symbolizes bad financial decisions. Mark nearly choked, laughing. Moments like that became their rhythm, naturally. Pressure, then laughter, stress, then comfort. Even during difficult weeks, Sharon somehow made life feel lighter without minimizing his struggles. That mattered more than Mark admitted aloud. One evening, after losing a major contract he desperately needed, Mark came home emotionally drained, not angry, worse, quiet. He tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter and loosened his tie slowly. Sharon looked up immediately from the stove. You okay? Mark forced a small nod. Long day. That answer alone told her everything. Because normally, Mark talked the second he walked through the door. Business updates, complaints, random observations. Tonight, he barely made eye contact. Sharon lowered the stove heat without pressing him further. Good relationships sometimes survive because one person knows when silence needs company instead of interrogation. Mark sat heavily at the kitchen island while rubbing his face with both hands. We lost the Frisco project. There it was. Sharon leaned against the counter quietly. That's the one you spent 3 months preparing for. Yeah. Mark laughed once under his breath. No humor inside it. They chose another company this morning. Sharon watched him carefully, noticing the tension in his shoulder, the exhaustion in his eyes, the frustration he tried disguising through calmness. What did they say? That we weren't established enough yet. He looked down bitterly. My father warned me this would happen. Sharon already knew what that meant. Mark's father believed emotional softness weakened ambition. Any setback became proof you weren't ruthless enough. "You know what I think?" Sharon asked gently. Mark exhaled tiredly. "What?" "I think you're carrying everybody else's voice inside your head, except your own." That made him look up. She walked toward him slowly. "You work harder than anybody I know," she continued, "but you act like your worth disappears every time something goes wrong." Mark stared at her quietly, because deep down, she wasn't wrong. Failure terrified him in ways he rarely admitted, not just financially, emotionally. Failure made him feel forgettable, replaceable, small. Sharon rested her hands lightly against his shoulder. "You are not your father," she said softly. The kitchen fell quiet after that, only the sound of simmering food behind them. Mark looked at her for several long seconds before finally pulling her gently closer. No dramatic speech, no perfect movie moment, just relief. The kind that comes when somebody understands the part of you constantly fighting itself. That night became the beginning of their kitchen dancing tradition. It happened accidentally. Sharon turned on music while finishing dinner, and Mark complained immediately. "Why do you always cook to old songs?" "Because modern music sounds emotionally confused. That's not a category." She ignored him completely, stirring food while swaying slightly beside the stove. Mark watched her for a second, then another, then finally walked over quietly and wrapped one arm around her waist from behind. Sharon smiled instantly. "Well, look at this," she teased softly. "Mr. Luxury Homes learned affection. Don't ruin the moment. You started it." The music played softly while they moved slowly around the kitchen together. No audience, no performance, no pressure, just warmth. And honestly, those small moments became the real foundation of their relationship. Not expensive dinner, not vacations, not status. The late-night conversations mattered more. The small jokes mattered more. The quiet support mattered more. Months later, Mark's business finally began growing faster. New investors, better contracts, larger projects, more attention. At first, Sharon celebrated every success with him genuinely. She framed his first magazine feature, surprised him with champagne after major deals, stayed awake listening to business ideas, even when exhausted herself. And Mark still loved her deeply then. That part matters. Because relationships rarely collapse all at once. Sometimes love remains present, while ego slowly changes the shape of it. The warning signs started small, almost invisible. Mark spending longer choosing outfits before events, checking his appearance more often in mirrors, caring more about which watch matched which client dinner. Nothing terrible yet, just subtle shifts. One evening, Sharon stood beside him while he adjusted his tie before a networking event downtown. "You've changed ties 3 times," she observed. Mark kept fixing the knot carefully. "Presentation matters. You used to say confidence mattered more." Confidence and presentation matter. Sharon studied him quietly in the mirror reflection. Tiny difference, tiny warning, easy to ignore, especially when love still felt strong. That night at the event, Sharon watched Mark from across the ballroom, while businessmen laughed loudly around him. Confident, sharp, admired. Women smiling too long at his jokes. Men respecting his growing influence. Mark looked successful now. Exactly the kind of man his father always wanted him to become. Sharon smiled proudly while watching him speak to investors beneath expensive chandelier. She didn't realize yet that success was beginning to feed something inside him that peace alone never could. The first compliment barely mattered. At least that's what Mark told himself. It happened during a real estate networking event at a luxury hotel in downtown Dallas, nearly a year after his company finally started becoming successful enough for people to recognize his name without introductions. A woman standing near the open bar smiled while looking at his watch. "That thing probably costs more than my rent." Mark glanced down casually. "It was a gift to myself." She laughed immediately, not because the comment was especially funny, because successful men attracted attention automatically. Mark noticed that more often lately. The easier laughter, the longer eye contact, the small touches on his arm during conversations. At first he found it harmless, even flattering. After years of stress, pressure, and constant work, admiration felt good. Too good. "You're Mark, right?" the woman asked. The housing developer? Mark nodded slightly. I've heard about your projects, she continued. You're doing really well for yourself. That sentence landed deeper than it should have, because Mark still carried the insecure boy raised around emotionally distant men who measured worth through achievement. Success never fully satisfied him. It only temporarily quieted the fear of becoming irrelevant. Across the ballroom, Sharon stood speaking warmly with another couple while holding a champagne glass near her chest. Elegant, relaxed, still naturally magnetic, without trying. Mark looked toward her automatically, and for a brief second, guilt touched him. Not because he had done anything terrible, because part of him enjoyed the attention too much. The woman near the bar leaned slightly closer. You don't seem like most guys at these events. Mark smiled politely. That sounds dangerous. It means you look less fake. If Sharon had heard that, she probably would have laughed for 3 business days straight. Mark almost smiled at the thought. Almost. But then another businessman interrupted the conversation, and the moment passed naturally, or at least it should have. Instead, Mark thought about it during the drive home. Not the woman specifically. The feeling, admiration, excitement, validation. Sharon sat beside him, removing her heels while the city lights passed outside the truck windows. You were popular tonight, she teased lightly. Mark kept his eyes on the road. Jealous? Please. Sharon laughed softly. Women flirt with money before they flirt with men. That sentence should have humbled him. Instead, it fed something dangerous, because now Mark started noticing attention everywhere. At restaurants, business, lunches, hotel bars, fundraisers, conferences, especially from younger women fascinated by confidence and luxury. And Mark increasingly enjoyed how they looked at him, like success itself made him younger somehow. It began subtly. Longer gym sessions, more expensive suits, new watches arriving almost monthly, hair appointments he suddenly cared about far more than before. Sharon noticed all of it quietly. One Saturday morning, she walked into the kitchen wearing one of his old t-shirts, while Mark stood checking himself in the dark microwave reflection. She stopped. You flirting with yourself now? Mark adjusted his collar. I have a meeting later. At the gym? He looked over. What's wrong with wanting to look decent? Nothing. Sharon grabbed coffee calmly. I'm just trying to figure out why your moisturizer suddenly costs more than groceries. Mark smirked slightly. You're dramatic. No, I'm observant. That word stayed in the air briefly. Observant. Sharon had always paid attention carefully. That used to make Mark feel loved. Now sometimes it made him feel exposed. Not because he was cheating yet, because part of him already knew he was changing. And deeper down, he liked parts of the change. That was the problem. A few weeks later, Sharon attended another event with him at a luxury country club outside Dallas. Mark spent nearly 40 minutes choosing between watches beforehand. Sharon sat at the edge of the bed, watching silently. You know both watches tell time, right? Mark laughed lightly while fastening the silver one around his wrist. One looks better. To who? He paused briefly. Tiny moment, tiny hesitation, then continued adjusting his cufflinks. You ask a lot of questions. That's usually what happens in conversations. Mark smiled faintly, but Sharon noticed the shift again. Lately he answered emotionally, instead of honestly whenever uncomfortable topics appeared. Deflection, charm, quick humor, anything except vulnerability. At the country club, several people greeted Mark almost immediately after arrival. His company was growing faster now. More projects, more investors, more attention. Sharon stayed beside him at first, while conversations moved around them smoothly. Then she noticed something else. Mark's posture changed around admiration. Subtle, but real. Straighter shoulder, longer smiles, more confidence in his voice. Like attention itself energized him. A younger woman near the outdoor lounge laughed loudly at something Mark said, even though the joke barely deserved a smile. Sharon noticed. More importantly, Mark noticed too. That part bothered her. Not the flirtation itself, the enjoyment behind his reaction. The younger woman touched Mark's arm lightly while asking another question about his business. He answered smoothly, comfortably, too comfortably. Sharon looked away toward the city skyline outside the balcony. A strange feeling settled quietly in her chest. Not panic, not jealousy. Distance. The kind that arrives before relationships openly crack. Later that night, Sharon sat removing earrings in front of the bathroom mirror, while Mark scrolled through his phone beside the bed. He smiled suddenly at something on the screen. Small smile. Fast smile, but noticeable. "What's funny?" Sharon asked casually. Mark locked the phone immediately. "Nothing." That answer came too fast. Sharon looked at him through the mirror reflection for a second longer than normal, then turned back toward her makeup remover silently. The room felt different afterward. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. Mark sensed it too, which annoyed him irrationally, because technically, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He hadn't crossed any major lines. No affair, no secret meetings, no betrayal yet. Just attention, just conversations, just admiration. But emotional distance rarely begins with one catastrophic decision. Sometimes it starts with tiny moments repeated long enough to become habits. And Mark was beginning to crave those moments, especially after difficult days. Attention distracted him from insecurity, from aging, from pressure, from the exhausting fear that success could disappear if he slowed down for even 1 second. The gym became another obsession quickly. Not health, image. Mark started waking before sunrise 5 days a week, spending nearly 2 hours training obsessively before work. Bigger arms, sharper jawline, lower body fat. Small improvements that made him feel temporarily in control again. One morning, Sharon walked into the kitchen half asleep, while Mark blended protein powder aggressively enough to sound like construction equipment. She stared at him. "You know, you're almost 40, right?" Mark looked offended instantly. "I'm 39. That wasn't the comforting correction you thought it was." He pointed the blender lid toward her dramatically, hating from the sidelines. "I miss pancakes," she replied honestly. Mark laughed despite himself. That used to happen naturally between them. Easy humor. But lately the moments disappeared faster afterward, because even while laughing with Sharon, part of Mark's attention stayed elsewhere now. On work, on image, on admiration, on who noticed him when he entered rooms. The dangerous part? He still genuinely loved Sharon. That complexity mattered, because if he stopped loving her completely, the choices would feel simpler, cleaner. Instead, Mark existed in emotional contradiction. He loved the woman who grounded him emotionally, while becoming addicted to attention that inflated his ego. And slowly those two needs began fighting each other. One evening, Sharon waited for him at home with dinner nearly finished by the time he arrived. Candles lit, music low, his favorite meal. Mark entered distracted, phone still in hand. "Sorry," he muttered absent-mindedly. "Long day." Sharon watched him carefully while he typed one final message before finally placing the phone face down. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah. Just work stuff." Another quick answer. Another emotional wall. During dinner, Sharon talked about a new interior styling opportunity she'd been excited about all week. Mark nodded occasionally while checking notifications beside his plate. At one point, she stopped talking entirely. Mark didn't notice for several seconds, then finally looked up. "What?" Sharon forced a small smile. "Nothing." But it wasn't nothing, and deep down, both of them knew it. Later that night, Sharon woke briefly, sometime after midnight. The bedroom remained dark, except for faint city light slipping through the curtains. Beside her, Mark sat slightly turned away, holding his phone low near his lap, smiling. Not huge, not obvious, but smiling. The second he noticed Sharon moving, he locked the screen immediately. Too quickly. Sharon stared at the darkness quietly for a moment. Mark cleared his throat softly. "Did I wake you?" She looked at him, then at the hidden phone in his hand, and for the first time in their marriage, something cold touched her intuition. Not proof, not certainty, just a feeling, a quiet warning she couldn't explain yet. "Yeah," she said softly. Mark placed the phone down carefully after that, but Sharon noticed something important while lying awake beside him afterward. He never unlocked it again until she pretended to fall back asleep. The first canceled date night happened on a Thursday. Sharon remembered because she had spent almost 2 hours cooking, not because Mark asked her to, because she missed him, not physically, emotionally. There's a difference people don't talk about enough. You can sleep beside somebody every night and still feel like you're slowly disappearing from their world. By 7:30, the candles were already lit across the dining table. Music played softly through the living room speaker. Sharon changed clothes twice before settling on a dark sweater Mark once told her made her look dangerously pretty. Back then, he said things like that randomly. Now compliments mostly appeared in public settings where other people could hear them. At 8:15, her phone buzzed. "Mark." She answered immediately. "Hey." His voice came through distracted. "Baby, I'm sorry. This meeting ran longer than expected. Sharon looked toward the untouched dinner quietly. That's okay. I'll make it up to you this weekend. That's fine. And she meant it, at least partly, because relationships survive busy seasons all the time. The problem wasn't one canceled night. It was the pattern beginning underneath it. Saturday came, another cancellation. This time because investors unexpectedly arrived from Fort Worth. The following week, Mark promised lunch. A client emergency interrupted that too. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. That's how emotional distance becomes dangerous. Nobody notices it immediately because every individual moment feels understandable. Until one day the relationship barely feels recognizable anymore. Sharon tried not to overreact. She really did. Instead of accusing Mark, she adjusted. She started eating dinner later. Stopped waiting near windows when his truck pulled into the driveway. Stopped planning elaborate evenings that left her sitting alone afterward. Even the kitchen dancing faded naturally. Not from one big argument. From absence. One Tuesday night, Sharon stood at the stove stirring pasta, while Mark sat nearby answering emails without looking up once. The television played quietly in the background. The house looked beautiful. Modern lighting, expensive furniture, everything polished, and somehow the entire place felt emotionally empty. You remember when we used to actually sit down during dinner? Sharon asked lightly. Mark kept typing. We're sitting down now. That's not what I meant. He finally glanced up, briefly. Can I finish this email first? Sharon nodded once. Sure. 10 minutes later, the food had gone cold. Mark still answered messages. At one point, he smiled faintly at something on his screen. That bothered Sharon more than she wanted to admit. Not because she thought every smile meant cheating. Because he smiled at his phone more than he smiled at her lately. The thought hurt quietly. Mark finally locked his phone and reached for his fork. Sorry. What were you saying earlier? Sharon looked at him across the table. The man she loved still sat there physically. Same face, same voice, same wedding ring. But emotionally, he felt farther away every week. Nothing important, she replied softly. Mark noticed the change in her tone immediately. You okay? Sharon almost laughed at the irony. He asked that question now more than he actually paid attention to the answer. I'm fine. And just like that, both of them participated in the distance growing between them. Weeks later, Sharon tried again. This time, simpler. No candles. No special dinner. Just effort. She walked into Mark's office one evening wearing one of his old college sweatshirts and leaned against the doorway. You want to disappear for a weekend? Mark looked up from spreadsheets. What? Just us. She shrugged lightly. Road trip. Bad coffee. Tiny motel. Make fun of your music taste. For a second, something softened in Mark's face. The old version of him almost returned. He even smiled. That actually sounds nice. Then let's go. Mark exhaled quietly and rubbed his forehead. I can't this weekend. Sharon's expression dimmed slightly. You said next weekend too. I know. Then pick another one. It's not that easy right now. There it was again. That invisible wall. Sharon walked further into the office, slowly. Mark, what? You've been saying, right now, for almost 6 months. He leaned back in his chair. I'm building something, Sharon, and I've supported that. I know. Do you? The room grew quiet after that. Mark looked tired instantly. Not angry yet, just defensive. A dangerous emotional shift was beginning between them, because Sharon approached problems emotionally, while Mark increasingly approached them like criticism. You act like I'm neglecting you, he muttered. Sharon stared at him carefully. I didn't say that. You're implying it. No. She folded her arms gently. I'm saying I miss my husband. That should have opened vulnerability. Instead, Mark looked cornered, because deep down, part of him already knew she was right, and guilt often transforms into irritation before honesty. I'm doing all this for us, he said. Sharon nodded slowly. I know you believe that. That's not fair. What isn't fair is me needing appointments to spend time with my own husband. Mark stood up immediately after that, not aggressive, restless. He walked toward the office windows overlooking downtown Dallas while loosening his tie. You think this is easy for me? He asked quietly. Sharon watched his back. No. I think you don't know how to stop. That sentence landed harder than she intended, because it was true. Mark stayed busy, partly because success felt addictive now. Every deal, every compliment, every moment of admiration. They temporarily filled something empty inside him. But temporary validation demands constant feeding, and Sharon was beginning to realize she was competing against something she couldn't emotionally satisfy anymore. Not another woman yet. His ego, that scared her more. Later that night, they lay beside each other in silence. Not angry silence. Worse, disconnected silence. The kind where both people feel the distance, but neither knows how to close it anymore. Sharon faced the ceiling, while Mark scrolled through business articles on his phone. You know what's strange? Sharon asked softly into the darkness. Mark hummed, distractedly. I used to feel safer with you than anywhere else. Mark looked over slightly. What changed? Sharon took a second before answering. You stopped being present, even when you're here. That hit him immediately. He hit it well, but Sharon noticed his jaw tighten faintly. You think I don't care anymore? He asked. That's not what I said. Then what are you saying? She turned toward him finally. I'm saying I feel alone sometimes. Mark sat up, slightly frustrated now. You have any idea how much pressure I'm under? Sharon closed her eyes briefly. There it is. What? Every conversation turns into pressure in business lately. She swallowed carefully. I miss talking to my husband without feeling like I'm interrupting a meeting. Mark looked away immediately, and that reaction alone told Sharon something painful. Part of him understood exactly what she meant, but instead of admitting it, he defended himself harder. I'm trying to secure our future, and I'm trying to hold on to our marriage. The room fell quiet again, heavy this time. Mark rubbed his face slowly. You're making this sound worse than it is. Sharon stared at him. That sentence hurt more than yelling would have. Because emotional loneliness becomes unbearable when the other person minimizes it. She didn't argue afterward, didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply rolled onto her side, facing away from him. Mark watched her quietly for a few seconds. Part of him wanted to reach for her, to apologize, to say something honest. But vulnerability had started feeling unfamiliar to him lately. So instead, he grabbed his phone again. That choice looked tiny, meaningless even. But small emotional decisions repeated long enough eventually become relationship fractures. Days later, Sharon attended another business dinner beside Mark. She wore a fitted black dress he once loved seeing her in. Earlier in their marriage, he probably would have spent half the evening touching her lower back proudly while introducing her to people. Tonight, Mark spent most of the event circulating through conversations while Sharon sat beside two investor wives discussing vacation homes and charity events. At one point, she watched from across the room as a younger woman laughed beside Mark near the bar. His posture changed again, that energized confidence, that polished charm. And suddenly, Sharon understood something deeply painful. Mark still knew how to show enthusiasm. He just no longer brought it home. The realization stayed with her all night, especially later while they drove home in silence through downtown Dallas. Mark finally glanced over. You're quiet. Sharon looked out the passenger window. Tired. That wasn't a lie. She was exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Because trying to reconnect with someone slowly drifting away from you feels like reaching for a hand that keeps moving farther every time you get close. Weeks passed. The distance deepened quietly. Conversations became shorter. Affection became less automatic. Even bedtime changed. Mark stayed awake later more often. Phone glowing softly against his face in the darkness. Sharon stopped asking who he was texting. Not because she stopped noticing, because she was beginning to fear the answer. One night she sat alone in the kitchen, long after midnight, holding a cup of tea that had already gone cold. The house remained silent except for the faint sound of Mark laughing softly upstairs at something on his phone. Sharon stared down into the untouched tea for several seconds, and for the first time in her marriage, she realized something heartbreaking. She felt lonelier beside her husband than she ever felt alone. Mark met her at a rooftop business party in Dallas during early spring, not during some dramatic moment. Not because he went looking for an affair that mattered, because people like simplifying betrayal into one bad decision. Real life usually happens slower than that. One compliment, one conversation, one moment of feeling admired at exactly the wrong time. The rooftop overlooked downtown lights, while expensive cocktails moved through the crowd on silver trays. Music pulsed softly beneath conversations about investments, property developments, and people pretending they enjoyed networking more than they actually did. Mark normally hated events like this, once the business conversations became repetitive, but lately, he enjoyed them more. Not the events themselves, the attention. Success had changed how people looked at him, especially younger women. And tonight, he noticed her watching him before they even spoke, not aggressively, curiously, the kind of look people give someone they've already heard about before meeting. Mark stood near the bar, loosening his tie slightly, when she approached beside him. "You're Mark, right?" He glanced over. Beautiful, confident enough to approach first, young enough that the age difference became obvious immediately. "You make that sound dangerous," Mark replied lightly. She smiled. "I work in luxury branding. Everybody here talks about money, the same way athletes talk about championships. And where do I fit into that conversation?" She lifted her drink slightly. "You're apparently the guy making half of Dallas richer." Mark laughed softly. Not because the line was original, because admiration still triggered something satisfying inside him. "You should lower your expectations," he said. "Too late now." The conversation stayed easy afterward, effortless, in a way that felt exciting, partly because it lacked weight. No emotional history, no difficult conversations, no tension waiting underneath the surface. Just attraction, just attention, just admiration. And Mark had become emotionally vulnerable to admiration. That was the dangerous part. She asked questions about business while listening with genuine interest, or at least what felt genuine in the moment. "How old were you when you started your company?" she asked. "Early 30s. "That's impressive." Mark shrugged casually, though internally he felt the compliment settle warmly in his chest. "You sound surprised." "I'm impressed," she smiled. "There's a difference." That smile stayed in his head longer than it should have afterward, especially because life at home felt increasingly heavy lately. Not hateful, heavy. Every conversation with Sharon now carried emotional reality attached to it. Distance, disappointment, loneliness, history. But this felt light, and Mark started craving lightness more than honesty. That terrified him later. Not yet. At first he convinced himself it was harmless. One conversation became another, then occasional texting, then business lunches disguised as networking meetings. Mark drew imaginary lines inside his head constantly. "I'm not cheating. This is just conversation." Nothing physical happened, but emotional betrayal rarely announces itself clearly in the beginning. Sometimes it grows quietly inside secrecy. One afternoon, Mark sat across from her at an upscale restaurant while she admired the skyline view through massive windows. "I swear rich people live differently," she said. Mark smirked. "You think I'm rich?" She looked at him like the answer was obvious. "You wear watches that could pay student loans." "That sounds financially irresponsible when you say it out loud." She laughed immediately. Mark liked making her laugh, not because he loved her, because her admiration made him feel younger, less tired, less emotionally trapped inside responsibility. She leaned forward slightly. "So what's your deal?" "My deal? You've got the successful businessman thing down, but you still act uncomfortable when people compliment you." That observation caught him off guard. Mark looked down briefly at his drink. "Nobody's ever accused me of acting uncomfortable." That means they weren't paying attention. The statement reminded him painfully of Sharon. Sharon noticed everything too. That thought should have stopped him, emotionally. Instead, he pushed it away, because comparing the two women honestly would have forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. The woman sitting across from him admired his lifestyle. Sharon understood his soul. Those are not the same thing. But validation can temporarily confuse people emotionally, especially insecure people. Over the next few weeks, the excitement deepened, naturally, not emotionally, chemically. That difference mattered. Everything felt easier around her, because nothing real had been tested yet. She had never seen Mark lose sleep over failing projects, panic quietly about financial pressure, sit emotionally drained at 2 a.m, question himself after business setbacks, carry childhood insecurity behind confidence. Sharon had seen all of it, still stayed, still loved him. The woman across from him now only experienced polished versions, rooftop dinners, luxury hotels, confident conversations, expensive wine, carefully controlled charm, and Mark increasingly preferred being admired over being fully known. One evening, she joined him at a private networking lounge after one of his development presentations. The room glowed softly beneath hanging gold lights, while quiet music floated through the space. "You know, everybody watches you when you walk into rooms," she said while sipping her drink. Mark smiled lightly. That sounds uncomfortable. No. She tilted her head slightly. It looks powerful. Powerful. That word hooked something dangerous inside him immediately. Because deep down, Mark feared aging more than he admitted. Feared becoming irrelevant, invisible, replaceable. Attention temporarily silenced those fears, even if only for a few hours. Meanwhile, Sharon noticed changes multiplying quietly at home. Not dramatic changes, behavioral ones. Mark caring too much about photographs before events, changing shirts multiple times, checking his appearance constantly before business dinners, buying another luxury watch, even though he already owned several. One evening, Sharon stood in the bedroom doorway, watching him adjust his jacket in the mirror. "You know you used to make fun of men like this," she said calmly. Mark glanced over. "Like what?" "Men obsessed with looking important." His expression shifted faintly. "I'm not obsessed." Sharon didn't argue. That almost bothered him more, because she looked thoughtful instead of jealous, like she was studying emotional patterns quietly. Later that same night, they attended another investor event together. Mark spent nearly the entire evening moving through conversations, while Sharon remained near the edge of the ballroom, speaking occasionally with guests. At one point, she watched him laugh beside a group near the bar, confident, relaxed, animated, a version of himself she barely saw at home anymore. That realization hurt. Not because he was enjoying himself, because he still had emotional energy. He just gave most of it away before returning home. Driving back that night, Sharon rested against the passenger seat quietly, while city lights reflected across the windshield. Mark noticed, eventually. "You okay?" She looked toward him. "Can I ask you something honestly?" "Sure. Are you still happy with me?" The question hit harder than he expected. Mark tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you don't look at me the same anymore." Mark exhaled quietly. That's not true. But even he heard something weak inside the answer. Sharon stared ahead again. "You used to talk to me," she said softly. "Now I mostly hear about work. I'm busy." "You've always been busy." That silence afterward stretched painfully across the truck. Mark hated conversations like this lately, not because Sharon was wrong, because she was getting too close to truths he didn't want to confront yet. "You think I'm cheating?" he asked suddenly. Sharon took a second before answering. "I think you're disappearing." That sentence stayed inside his head for days afterward, because deep down, part of him knew exactly what she meant, and still, he kept moving toward the attention anyway. The dangerous thing about emotional validation is how quickly it becomes addictive once somebody starts depending on it, especially someone already afraid of aging, afraid of emotional emptiness, afraid of silence. One Friday evening, Mark sat across from the younger woman inside an upscale hotel lounge, while rain slid slowly down the windows outside. She laughed while showing him photos from a luxury fashion event she attended recently. Mark listened comfortably while loosening his tie. No emotional pressure here. No difficult conversations. No history demanding accountability. Just admiration. Easy admiration. His phone buzzed against the table. Sharon. Mark looked at the screen. The younger woman noticed immediately. "You should answer." He hesitated. Tiny moment, but important, because guilt finally appeared clearly for the first time. Not enough to stop him, just enough to make him uncomfortable. Mark flipped the phone face down instead. "She's probably checking if I made it here okay," he muttered. The younger woman looked uncertain briefly. "You're married." Not accusation, observation. Mark rubbed his jaw slowly. "Yeah." Another silence settled between them, this one heavier than before, because pretending became harder once reality entered the room openly. His phone buzzed again. Mark ignored it. But now Sharon's name, sitting unanswered on the table, felt impossible not to notice. A memory crossed his mind suddenly. Sharon dancing barefoot in their kitchen years ago, laughing while stirring pasta sauce, calling his expensive boots emotionally suspicious. The memory hit fast enough to hurt. Mark looked down briefly, and for the first time since all this attention started, he felt ashamed. Not enough to walk away. Not enough to confess, not enough to stop, but enough to understand something dangerous was already happening inside him. Because while sitting beside admiration and excitement, part of him suddenly missed home. The first thing Sharon noticed was the cologne. Not because it smelled bad, because Mark never used it. before. She caught the scent one Wednesday evening while standing behind him in their bathroom as he loosened his tie after another late client dinner. Warm, sharp, expensive, the kind of fragrance men wore when they wanted to leave impressions behind. After conversations ended, Mark tossed his cufflinks onto the counter casually, while Sharon folded towels beside him. "You changed cologne," she said calmly. Mark paused for half a second. Tiny pause. Easy to miss. "I've had this." "No," Sharon replied softly. "You haven't." Mark opened a drawer without looking at her. "It was sitting in my office for months." Sharon nodded once. Maybe that explanation was true. Maybe not. The problem wasn't the cologne itself. It was what came with it. New habits, new energy, new distance. Mark had started carrying himself differently over the last several months. More polished, more careful, more aware of how people saw him. Even his silences changed. Before, silence around Mark usually meant exhaustion. Now it often felt like distraction. Like part of him stayed somewhere else emotionally even while standing directly beside her. That feeling followed Sharon constantly now. At dinner, in bed, inside conversations that ended too quickly, even during small moments. One Friday night they sat on opposite sides of the couch while a movie played unnoticed in the background. Sharon rested beneath a blanket, scrolling absent-mindedly through decorating ideas on her tablet. Beside her, Mark stared at his phone, smiling faintly again, not openly. Private smile. The kind people don't realize they're making. Sharon lowered her tablet slightly. "What's funny?" Mark locked the screen instantly. "Work stuff." That answer arrived too smoothly now. "Practiced." Sharon studied him quietly for a second before returning her attention to the tablet. She didn't push further. That's what made Sharon different. She understood something many people didn't. When someone starts hiding pieces of themselves, forcing truth too early usually teaches them how to lie better. So instead, she watched, and the more she watched, the more patterns appeared. Business trips increased suddenly, especially overnight ones. Mark started mentioning cities casually over breakfast. Austin, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Houston. Sometimes he barely explained the meetings at all. One morning, Sharon stood near the kitchen island pouring coffee while Mark packed another suitcase upstairs. "You're gone 2 nights this time?" she asked. Probably. Mark came downstairs adjusting his watch. "The schedule depends on investors." Sharon handed him coffee carefully. "What investors?" Mark blinked once. "The Commercial Project Group." Another tiny hesitation before the answer. Not huge. But Mark used to answer questions naturally. Now every response sounded edited first. Sharon noticed that too. He kissed her forehead before leaving. The gesture should have felt affectionate. Instead, something about it landed strangely forced. Like Mark remembered he was supposed to do it. After the front door closed, Sharon stood alone in the kitchen holding her untouched coffee for several seconds. The house felt too quiet lately. Not physically, emotionally. Even when Mark was home, the warmth between them kept thinning in ways difficult to describe aloud. That scared her more than obvious betrayal would have, because emotional disappearance arrives slowly. You notice it in fragments. Less eye contact, less storytelling, less random touching, less laughter inside ordinary moments. Sharon noticed all of it. One evening, Mark returned from another trip, carrying expensive shopping bags from a luxury store inside the Dallas airport. "Thought you might like this," he said while handing Sharon a designer scarf. She unfolded it slowly. Beautiful fabric. Very expensive. Completely impersonal. Sharon smiled politely. "Thank you." Mark relaxed immediately after seeing the smile. That bothered her too, because he looked relieved by successful distraction, like gifts could replace emotional presence. "You didn't have to buy me anything," she said carefully. "It's just a gift." "I know." But both of them understood the conversation wasn't really about scarves. Later that night, Sharon hung the scarf carefully inside her closet before staring at it quietly. Years ago, Mark used to bring home small things that actually reflected her personality. Old vinyl records, books connected to conversations they'd shared, funny souvenirs from Texas road trips. Now the gifts looked expensive, but emotionally empty, like somebody shopping from obligation instead of intimacy. The realization hurt more than she expected. Another pattern appeared weeks later. Mark started becoming protective of his phone in subtle ways. Nothing dramatic, just behavioral shifts, taking it everywhere, turning the screen downward automatically, replying to messages while walking into other rooms. One Saturday morning, Sharon sat cross-legged on the couch, reviewing design sketches, while Mark showered upstairs. His phone buzzed against the kitchen counter repeatedly. Sharon ignored it at first. Then the buzzing continued. 3 times, 4, 5. Finally, she walked over, intending to silence it, before the noise continued endlessly. The screen lit up before she reached it. No name, just a number, but the preview message appeared clearly enough. Last night was fun. Sharon stopped moving. Not dramatic, not frozen, just still. The bathroom water continued running upstairs. Her eyes stayed on the screen another second before it disappeared dark again. The strange thing, her first emotion wasn't anger. It was sadness, because suddenly dozens of tiny moments started connecting quietly inside her mind. The late-night smiles, the distance, the defensiveness, the emotional absence. Sharon rested one hand against the counter slowly, then stepped away before Mark returned downstairs. When he entered the kitchen minutes later wearing a fresh shirt and expensive cologne again, Sharon remained seated calmly on the couch. Phone kept buzzing, she said casually without looking up. Mark dried his hair with a towel. Oh, probably work. Lie. Easy lie. Smooth lie. And somehow that hurt even worse. Not because Sharon needed immediate confession, because Mark no longer trusted her enough to tell the truth. She nodded lightly. That was all. No accusation. No confrontation. And honestly, that silence unsettled Mark more than anger probably would have. Over the following days, Sharon became quieter emotionally, not colder, observant, watching, listening, feeling the emotional rhythm of her marriage, changing underneath ordinary routines. One night, Mark reached for her in bed after several days of distance. The affection came suddenly, too suddenly. Sharon recognized guilt immediately, not because she knew everything yet, because emotional timing tells stories words try hiding. Mark kissed her shoulder softly. "You've been distant lately," he murmured. The irony nearly broke her heart. Sharon turned toward him slowly. "I've been distant?" Mark exhaled quietly. "You know what I mean." "No," she replied gently. "I don't think I do." The room stayed quiet after that. Mark touched her arm again, but Sharon noticed something painful. Even intimacy felt distracted now, like part of him remained mentally elsewhere. That realization changed something inside her permanently. A week later, Sharon started organizing laundry before another one of Mark's overnight trips. Nothing unusual, just routine. She checked jacket pockets automatically before sending clothes for cleaning. Receipts, business cards, parking stubs, normal things. Then her fingers paused. Hotel receipt. Dallas, not Austin, not the city Mark claimed he visited earlier that week. 1 room, 2-night stay. Sharon stared at the paper quietly. The air inside the laundry room suddenly felt heavy, not because the receipt confirmed every detail, because deep down, she already knew. The receipt simply gave physical shape to feelings she'd been carrying for months. Upstairs, Mark moved around their bedroom unaware. Sharon folded the receipt once carefully, then placed it back exactly where she found it. No tears, no dramatic confrontation, no screaming, just silence. And somehow, that silence became far more powerful than rage. The first real argument started over a plate. Not betrayal, not cheating, not lies. A plate. Mark walked into the kitchen late Tuesday evening, while Sharon stood loading the dishwasher after dinner. The house smelled faintly like garlic, soap, and the candle burning near the sink. Mark loosened his tie with one hand, while scrolling through emails with the other. Without looking up, he placed his empty plate directly beside the sink instead of inside the dishwasher Sharon already had opened. Tiny thing. Ordinary thing. But exhaustion changes the weight of ordinary things. Sharon stared at the plate for a second, then at him. "You were literally standing next to the dishwasher." Mark kept typing. The dishwasher. He glanced over briefly. "Oh, nothing else." No movement toward the plate. No acknowledgement beyond that. Sharon closed the dishwasher slowly. "Mark, what? You couldn't put the plate inside?" Mark finally looked up, already irritated. "I just got home. And I forgot." The conversation should have ended there. Normally, it would have. But tension had been collecting quietly between them for months now. Little disappointments stacking on top of each other until even harmless moments carried emotional weight. Sharon folded the kitchen towel carefully. "It's not really about the plate." Mark laughed, once under his breath. "Here we go." That response hit her immediately. Not because it was cruel, because it sounded tired, dismissive, like emotional conversations had become inconveniences to him. Sharon leaned against the counter. "You've been saying that a lot lately." "Saying what?" "Here we go." Mark rubbed his forehead. "Sharon, I'm exhausted." "So am I." He looked at her, then actually looked, and for one quick second guilt crossed his face, before frustration covered it again. "You think I enjoy working this much?" "No," Sharon answered honestly. "I think you hide inside it." The kitchen went quiet. Mark grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator harder than necessary. "You make everything psychological." "No, I pay attention." "There's a difference?" "Yes." Mark shook his head and walked toward the living room. Conversation over. At least for him. That became another pattern. Mark increasingly ended emotional discussions before resolution could happen, not intentionally every time. Sometimes he simply lacked the emotional stamina for honesty. Other times, he was afraid honesty would force him to confront himself. Sharon remained in the kitchen after he left, staring down at the untouched plate beside the sink. The argument wasn't about dishes. It was about effort, presence, feeling considered, feeling emotionally seen. And lately, she didn't feel any of those things anymore. The next few weeks carried the same uncomfortable rhythm. Small comments, small tensions, small emotional cuts nobody else would notice from outside the marriage. One Saturday afternoon, Sharon walked into the living room, holding 2 movie tickets. "I thought maybe we could go out tonight," she said softly. Mark sat reviewing contracts at the dining table. "What time?" 7. Mark checked his watch automatically, then his phone, then his calendar. Sharon noticed every movement. "I might have a client dinner." "Might." "They're confirming." Sharon looked down at the tickets quietly. "I already bought these." Mark sighed. "Why would you buy them before asking me?" That sentence changed the entire atmosphere instantly. Not because it was aggressive, because Sharon heard the emotional message underneath it. "Why assume I'd prioritize you?" She placed the tickets carefully on the table. "You know what?" she said calmly. "Never mind." Mark leaned back in his chair. "Why are you acting like this lately?" The question almost made her laugh. Acting like this. As if loneliness had appeared from nowhere. Sharon crossed her arms lightly. "Like what?" "Everything feels tense now." She stared at him carefully. "You really don't see it?" Mark looked away first. That answer alone told her enough. Later that night, they sat through dinner, mostly in silence. Not angry silence. Emotionally exhausted silence. The kind where both people still care, but no longer know how to reach each other properly. At one point, Sharon tried reviving the mood gently. "You remember that motel outside San Antonio?" she asked softly. Mark looked up briefly from his phone. "What motel?" "The one with the terrible coffee and broken air conditioning." Recognition finally crossed his face. A small smile almost appeared. "Yeah, you danced terribly." "I danced perfectly." "You stepped on my foot." "You survived." For one quick second, the old warmth nearly returned. Then Mark's phone buzzed. His attention disappeared instantly. Smile gone. Eyes back on the screen. And Sharon felt something inside her quietly collapse. Not dramatically, just painfully. Because their happy memories now felt like conversations she was having alone. That night, intimacy failed between them for the first time in a way neither fully discussed afterward. Mark reached for Sharon gently in bed after midnight. Maybe from guilt. Maybe from genuine longing. Maybe both. Relationships become complicated when love still exists underneath damage. Sharon kissed him back at first, but halfway through, something felt emotionally disconnected, mechanical, like they were trying to recreate closeness instead of naturally feeling it. Mark noticed too. "You okay?" he whispered. Sharon looked away slightly. "Yeah." Lie. He knew it. She knew it. But neither had enough emotional courage left to unpack the truth at 1 a.m. Mark pulled away first and sat at the edge of the bed rubbing his face. The silence afterward hurt worse than rejection. Sharon wrapped the blanket closer around herself. "I miss us," she admitted quietly. Mark stayed facing away from her. "We're still here." "No," Sharon said softly. "We live in the same house." That sentence stayed hanging between them long after the room went dark again. Over time, even their jokes started failing. That part scared Sharon, almost as much as the distance itself. Humor used to come naturally between them. Kitchen teasing, road trip sarcasm, little comments only they understood. Now conversations often ended awkwardly halfway through. One evening, Sharon walked into Mark's home office, carrying takeout bags. "Thought I'd save you from another tragic protein shake dinner." Mark barely glanced up from his laptop. "You're a hero." "Wow." Sharon sat the food down dramatically. "The romance is overwhelming." Normally, Mark would have laughed immediately. Instead, he muttered distractedly, "Long day." That phrase had become emotional wallpaper inside their marriage. Long day, busy week, stressful schedule, investor meeting, client dinner. Every explanation technically reasonable. Every explanation slowly destroying intimacy anyway. Sharon sat across from him quietly while he continued typing. Finally, she asked softly, "Do you even like being around me anymore?" Mark froze slightly. Not visibly enough for most people, but Sharon noticed because she noticed everything. What kind of question is that? An honest one. Mark closed the laptop harder than intended. "Why does every conversation turn into this now?" "Because we never finish them." "I'm tired, Sharon." "So am I." He stood up restless again, pacing toward the office window. That movement had become familiar too. Mark physically moved whenever emotions cornered him. "You think I'm some terrible husband lately," he muttered. Sharon watched him quietly. "I think you're disappearing while pretending everything's normal." Mark laughed bitterly. "You always make things sound dramatic." "No." Her voice stayed calm. "I make things sound honest." The room fell silent again. Mark stared out toward the city lights. Part of him hated these moments, because Sharon forced emotional reflection he no longer wanted to face. But another part hated himself afterward for making her feel this alone. That complexity tortured him privately. Because despite everything, he still loved her, which made his choices uglier, not cleaner. A few days later, Sharon stopped initiating difficult conversations altogether. That change happened quietly. No announcement, no speech. She simply stopped reaching emotionally, stopped asking if he wanted date nights, stopped questioning late work calls, stopped trying to rescue the connection by herself. At first, Mark almost felt relieved. Less tension, less emotional confrontation. The house became calmer. But eventually, something else replaced the arguments. Distance. Real distance. One night, Mark came downstairs late and found Sharon asleep on the couch with a blanket across her lap and a book resting against her chest. The television played softly nearby. Normally, she would have waited awake for him, asked about his day, tried connecting somehow. Tonight, she simply fell asleep without him. Mark stood there longer than necessary, watching her. A strange feeling tightened in his chest. Not panic yet, but close, because for the first time, he realized Sharon might be getting emotionally tired of fighting for them. And the terrifying part? He didn't know how to stop the damage anymore. By then, it was already happening too fast. The invitation arrived on a Monday afternoon. Elegant black envelope, gold lettering, private networking dinner, hosted at one of the most expensive restaurants in downtown Dallas. Investors, developers, business owners, the kind of event Mark cared deeply about now. Sharon found the envelope sitting near the front door while bringing groceries inside. She read the invitation once, before placing it carefully on the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl. Years ago, events like this used to excite both of them, back when they still felt like a team, walking into rooms together. Now the invitation felt heavier somehow, like another performance waiting to happen. Mark came home nearly an hour later than expected, carrying the familiar smell of expensive cologne and city air behind him. Sharon stood rinsing vegetables at the sink. "You got another dinner invite," she said, without turning around. Mark loosened his tie while walking toward the refrigerator. "Which one?" She nodded toward the counter. Mark grabbed the envelope immediately. Recognition crossed his face. "Oh, right." Sharon noticed the expression carefully. Not excitement. Calculation. That bothered her quietly. "You're going?" she asked. Probably. Another word that had started appearing too often lately. Mark opened a bottle of water while scanning the invitation again. "Big investors will be there." Sharon dried her hands slowly with a towel. "Do you want me to come?" The question landed between them softly. Simple question. Complicated answer. Mark hesitated just long enough for Sharon to notice. Tiny pause. Tiny, emotional crack. Then he nodded. "Yeah. Of course. But the warmth behind those words felt missing. Sharon gave a small nod and returned to the sink. Mark watched her quietly for a second, before looking back down at the invitation. His chest tightened faintly. Guilt again. Not strong enough to stop anything, just strong enough to make him uncomfortable inside silence. That night, Sharon lay awake long after Mark fell asleep beside her. Streetlights slipped softly through the bedroom curtains while the ceiling fan hummed overhead. She stared into the darkness, thinking about patterns, not isolated moments. Patterns. The hidden phone, the changed routines, the emotional distance, the hotel receipt she never mentioned, the unfamiliar cologne, the forced affection, and now this dinner. Something about it felt important emotionally. She couldn't explain why yet, but her instincts had stopped feeling uncertain weeks ago. Now they felt painfully clear. Beside her, Mark shifted slightly in his sleep. Sharon looked toward him quietly. There was a time she could read every emotion on his face without effort. Now even sleeping beside him sometimes felt like lying next to someone, emotionally behind glass, close enough to touch, too far away to reach. The next morning, Mark woke earlier than usual, already checking messages. Before fully getting out of bed, Sharon pretended to stay asleep, not because she enjoyed spying, because pretending sometimes revealed more truth than confrontation. Mark smiled faintly at one message before typing quickly. Then another. Then another. The glow from the screen reflected against his face in the darkness. Sharon closed her eyes again slowly. That small private smile hurt more every time she saw it, because she remembered when those smiles belonged to her naturally. At breakfast, Mark seemed strangely energized, more alert, more focused on appearance. He changed shirts twice before leaving for work. Sharon sat at the kitchen island sipping coffee while watching him silently. "You've changed clothes 3 times, she observed calmly. Mark adjusted his cuff. "This meeting matters more than the others?" He glanced over briefly. "You're asking a lot of questions lately." There it was again. Deflection disguised as irritation. Sharon looked down at her coffee. "You used to answer them." The room quieted immediately. Mark grabbed his keys from the counter. "I'll probably be late tonight." "Okay." No argument, no emotional push. That unsettled him more than frustration would have, because Sharon had stopped chasing reassurance lately, and Mark was beginning to notice. Later that evening, Sharon stood in their walk-in closet deciding what to wear for the upcoming dinner. Several dresses hung neatly beside each other, while soft music played from her phone nearby. Normally, she would have asked Mark's opinion. Now she simply studied herself silently in the mirror, not searching for beauty, searching for emotional clarity. One dress reminded her of happier years immediately. An anniversary dinner in Austin. Mark unable to stop staring at her across the restaurant, his hand resting naturally against her lower back afterward while they walked through the city, laughing about bad street musicians. The memory tightened painfully inside her chest, not because she missed romance alone, because she missed emotional safety. Downstairs, Mark entered the house while finishing another phone conversation. "Yeah," he muttered quietly. "Thursday works." Sharon listened carefully from upstairs. Silence. "No. She'll be there." Another pause. Mark's tone softened slightly. "I know." Sharon stood completely still beside the closet. Something cold moved through her stomach slowly. Not panic, recognition. Mark entered the bedroom a few minutes later, still carrying his phone. "You talking to investors?" Sharon asked casually. Mark hesitated. "Yeah." Lie. Easy lie again. Sharon turned back toward the mirror before he could study her face too closely. The strange thing was, the lies no longer shocked her. That part scared her most. Because once disappointment becomes expected, something inside a relationship starts emotionally shutting down for protection. Thursday arrived faster than either of them expected. The entire house felt tense from morning onward. Not openly hostile, careful, measured, like both people understood something important was approaching without discussing it directly. Mark spent nearly 45 minutes getting ready before the dinner. Hair perfectly styled, dark-tailored suit, silver watch, cologne stronger than usual. Sharon noticed every detail quietly, while fastening earrings in the bathroom mirror nearby. "You look nervous," she said softly. Mark adjusted his cufflinks. "I'm not nervous. You keep checking your watch." He stopped moving briefly, then continued. "Big night." Sharon nodded slowly. "Big night." Interesting choice of words. She finished applying lipstick, before turning toward him fully. Mark glanced at her automatically, and despite everything, his breath caught slightly. Sharon looked stunning tonight. Elegant, black dress, simple makeup, quiet confidence. For one brief second, guilt slammed into him hard enough to almost speak honestly. Almost? But ego and fear had already tangled too deeply inside him by now. "You look nice," he said. Nice. Years ago, he would have crossed the room immediately, touched her waist, kissed her forehead, said something playful. Now compliments sounded careful, distant. Sharon noticed that too. "Thank you," she replied softly. The drive downtown carried almost no conversation. Dallas lights reflected across the windshield, while soft jazz played quietly through the speaker. Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter than normal. Sharon watched city buildings pass outside her window calmly. "You know what's strange?" she said suddenly. Mark glanced over cautiously. "What?" "We used to have fun together before events." Mark swallowed once. Neither of them spoke after that, because both remembered it instantly. The teasing, the flirting, the stolen kisses before entering crowded rooms, the teamwork. Now the silence between them felt professionally maintained, like strangers trying to avoid conflict during a long ride. When they finally arrived downtown, valet lights reflected against polished cars lined outside the restaurant entrance. Luxury everywhere. Expensive dresses, business laughter, glass walls glowing above the city. Mark stepped out first, before walking around toward Sharon's side, automatically. Old habit. She accepted his hand politely while exiting the truck, but even that touch felt unfamiliar now. Inside the restaurant lobby, several investors greeted Mark warmly. Almost immediately, Sharon stood beside him, smiling gracefully through introductions. Watching, observing, feeling. One businessman shook Mark's hand firmly. "Glad you made it tonight. Wouldn't miss it," Mark replied. Then another investor smiled politely toward Sharon. "You always make these events look better." Sharon thanked him softly. Mark laughed lightly beside them. But Sharon noticed something strange immediately. His energy looked split tonight, partially present, partially waiting, like he expected something else, or someone else. The realization settled heavily inside her chest. Minutes later, a hostess approached carefully. "Your private table is prepared upstairs." Mark nodded. "Perfect." As they followed the hostess toward the elevator, Sharon noticed Mark checking his phone again quickly. One message, fast glance, then hidden immediately. Sharon looked forward again calmly, emotionally preparing herself without fully understanding why, yet the elevator doors opened upstairs. Soft jazz floated through the private dining space. Candlelight reflected across crystal glasses. Wealthy couples filled the room already, and suddenly, everything from the opening hook was seconds away from happening. Then, the restaurant doors opened behind them, and Mark walked in, with the younger woman beside him. The elevator doors slid open quietly. Soft jazz drifted through the private dining floor, while warm golden lighting reflected across crystal glasses and polished silverware. Conversations floated carefully between wealthy couples, seated around the long candlelit table near the windows overlooking downtown Dallas. Everything inside the room looked expensive, controlled, refined, and emotionally seconds away from disaster. Sharon stepped out of the elevator first beside the hostess, while Mark followed a few feet behind, checking his phone one final time. The younger woman stood beside him. Elegant, black dress, carefully styled hair, nervous smile hidden beneath confidence she was trying hard to maintain. At first, nobody noticed. Several guests continued talking softly, while servers carried wine bottles between tables. Then one businessman, near the center of the room, looked toward the entrance. His expression changed immediately. Not dramatic, just enough. The conversation beside him slowed. Another woman turned subtly in her chair, then another. Recognition moved through the room quietly. That wasn't Sharon beside Mark, except Sharon was already there. The emotional confusion lasted only seconds before realization settled heavily across the table. Nobody reacted loudly. That made it worse. One woman stopped mid-sentence while holding her wine glass near her mouth. A man beside her adjusted his posture awkwardly without speaking. Another guest suddenly became deeply interested in unfolding his napkin. The room didn't explode. It tightened. Mark noticed the attention instantly, and for one dangerous moment, he enjoyed it, because part of him still believed this entrance made him look powerful, desired, important. A successful older man, arriving beside younger beauty. That image had been normalized around him his entire life. Men in his family practically celebrated behavior like this once enough money entered the picture. Mark straightened slightly while walking deeper into the room. The younger woman stayed close beside him, though her eyes moved carefully now from face to face. Something felt wrong. She sensed it immediately. "What's happening?" she whispered softly. Mark forced an easy smile. "Relax." But his voice sounded tighter than usual. Across the room, Sharon stood near the candlelit table speaking quietly with another investor's wife. When she finally turned fully toward the entrance, their eyes met, and suddenly the entire room emotionally shifted around them, because Sharon didn't react the way anybody expected. No visible panic, no public anger, no tears, no dramatic confrontation. She simply looked at Mark steadily for several long seconds. Calm, elegant, composed enough to make everybody else uncomfortable for her. That composure unsettled Mark immediately. Deep down, he expected emotional chaos tonight. Expected Sharon to cry, expected confrontation, expected visible heartbreak. Instead, she looked like someone who had already walked through pain privately long before entering this room, and somehow, that made Mark feel exposed in ways he didn't prepare for. The younger woman glanced carefully toward Sharon again. Realization finally settled completely across her face. Oh, just one word. Quiet, but filled with sudden understanding, because now she knew this wasn't a separated marriage. This wasn't some clean emotional ending. The wife was standing right there, and the room clearly respected her. One businessman approached Mark cautiously, with an awkward smile. "Mark, good seeing you," Mark replied quickly, gripping the handshake harder than necessary. The businessman nodded toward the younger woman politely. Mark hesitated, only for a second, but Sharon noticed immediately. Everybody close enough noticed. Mark cleared his throat softly before saying her name quietly. The younger woman offered a polite smile. The businessman returned it carefully, but his eyes drifted almost immediately toward Sharon afterward. That tiny movement changed everything, emotionally, because for the first time all evening, Mark realized something important. People weren't admiring him. They were evaluating him, judging him carefully. A server approached carrying champagne glasses. Even she looked nervous now. Sharon stepped forward first before the atmosphere could grow even more awkward, and somehow her grace made the entire moment more humiliating for Mark. "Good evening," Sharon said warmly to the younger woman. Not fake warmth, not exaggerated kindness, just dignity. The younger woman blinked slightly before answering. "Huh?" Her confidence weakened visibly now, because Sharon didn't look bitter. She looked controlled. That frightened people more. Mark pulled out a chair at the table, while pretending comfort. "Hope we're not late," he joked lightly. No one laughed immediately. A delayed chuckle came from the far end of the table, before disappearing quickly. The younger woman sat beside Mark carefully, while Sharon returned to her own seat across from them, and suddenly the emotional positioning became impossible to ignore. Wife, mistress, same table, same room, same silence, pressing against everyone's chest. One investor's wife reached for her wine too quickly and nearly knocked over the glass. Another guest stared down at the menu without reading a single word. Nobody knew where to look comfortably anymore. Mark attempted normal conversation immediately. "How's the commercial expansion project going?" A businessman answered politely enough, but the rhythm felt wrong now. Every sentence carried emotional awareness underneath it. The younger woman folded her hands carefully in her lap. Mark noticed. Earlier she had looked excited walking into the restaurant. Now she looked uncertain. That irritated him slightly, because part of Mark desperately needed this evening to feel impressive. Instead, the atmosphere kept slipping further out of his control. A server began pouring wine. Sharon thanked him softly. The younger woman copied her tone instinctively afterward. Mark reached for his glass quickly, too quickly. The base tapped lightly against the table before he steadied it. Small sound. But in a room this tense, every movement felt louder. Sharon noticed immediately. Years ago, Mark did the same thing before major business presentations whenever nerves started taking over. That memory crossed her face briefly before disappearing again. One older businessman finally attempted rescuing the conversation. "Beautiful turnout tonight," he said carefully. Sharon smiled politely. "The restaurant did an amazing job with the space." Mark nodded quickly. "Yeah, looks incredible," but nobody fully settled again afterward. because the emotional reality sitting at the table kept interrupting every normal interaction. The younger woman leaned slightly toward Mark and whispered quietly, "Maybe I should leave." Mark answered immediately, "No, too fast, too firm." That response drew attention from two nearby guests instantly. The younger woman lowered her eyes afterward, and for the first time all evening, embarrassment touched her expression clearly. Not because she suddenly became morally enlightened, because she finally understood the emotional weight of the situation she stepped into. Across the table, Sharon remained composed while unfolding her napkin carefully. No shaking hands, no visible breakdown, but internally, every heartbeat felt heavier than the last. Not because she lacked emotion, because she had already spent months grieving privately. The public humiliation hurt. Of course it did. But the deepest pain actually arrived earlier. Late nights alone, unanswered emotional questions, the hotel receipt, the hidden smiles at glowing phone screens. Tonight simply confirmed what her instincts already knew, and strangely enough, that truth made her calmer. Mark kept trying to force the evening back into normal rhythm. Business talk, investment updates, casual humor, but every attempt landed awkwardly because the room had emotionally shifted away from him already. One investor asked Sharon about an interior design project she completed recently. The conversation around her flowed naturally, easy, warm, respectful. People listened when she spoke. That mattered. Mark noticed it. The younger woman noticed it too. And suddenly the difference between admiration and genuine respect became painfully visible inside the room. Admiration looked exciting from far away. Respect looked stable, earned, real. The younger woman slowly leaned back in her chair while studying Sharon more carefully now, probably expecting bitterness. Instead, she found emotional maturity. That discomfort grew visible every minute. One woman near the center of the table finally smiled gently toward Sharon. "You always organize these dinners beautifully." Mark looked down immediately because he forgot something important. Sharon helped build many of these business relationships beside him over the years. She wasn't just the wife. People genuinely valued her presence. And now, those same people were quietly watching him humiliate her publicly. That realization finally started cracking through his ego. Not fully, but enough. Mark reached for his wine again. This time, his hand remained perfectly steady. Unfortunately, his confidence didn't, because all around the table, people were no longer questioning Sharon. They were questioning him. And for the first time that night, Mark realized his power move didn't make him look admired. It made him look weak. The appetizers arrived, untouched. Servers moved carefully around the table, refilling wine glasses while pretending not to notice the emotional pressure hanging over the room. Nobody relaxed. Not really. Even conversations sounded strained now, too measured, too cautious. Mark kept trying to pull attention back toward business topics, but the atmosphere refused to cooperate. Every sentence felt like it was balancing on thin ice. Across from him, Sharon sat with quiet composure beside the candlelight. Elegant posture, calm expression, controlled breathing. And somehow, that calmness kept making Mark feel worse, because deep down he knew what everyone expected from this situation. A scene, tears, anger, public emotional collapse. Instead, Sharon looked emotionally prepared. That terrified him more than rage would have. The younger woman sat beside Mark, unusually quiet now, fingers resting carefully around the stem of her wine glass. Earlier that evening, she looked impressed walking into the restaurant. Now, she mostly looked uncomfortable. One businessman cleared his throat softly while attempting another conversation starter. "So Mark," he began carefully, "heard the Frisco expansion finally closed." Mark nodded quickly. "Yeah. Long process, but worth it." "That project almost killed him," Sharon said softly before lifting her wine glass calmly. The table grew quiet again, not because Sharon raised her voice, because she sounded reflective instead of emotional. Mark glanced toward her immediately. Sharon continued gently. "There was a point during that project where he barely slept 3 hours a night. A few guests shifted slightly in their seats. Mark forced a small smile. Those were rough months." Sharon nodded once. They really were. And suddenly the conversation no longer belonged to him. That shift happened gradually, almost invisibly, but everyone felt it, because Sharon wasn't attacking Mark. She was reminding the room who stood beside him before success polished his image. "One night," Sharon continued softly, "he sat on our kitchen floor at 2 a.m, convinced everything was collapsing." Mark's jaw tightened faintly. The younger woman looked toward him carefully now. Sharon rested her fingers lightly beside her wine glass. "He kept apologizing for failing," she added, "even though nothing had failed yet." Nobody interrupted. Nobody wanted to, because Sharon's voice carried something stronger than anger. "Truth. He used to carry pressure quietly," she said. "Like if he stopped performing for even a second, people would stop respecting him." Mark stared down at the table. That line hit too close. The older businessman near the center of the room gave a slow nod. "Success does strange things to people sometimes." Sharon smiled faintly. Yes, her eyes drifted calmly toward Mark. "Especially when they start believing admiration matters more than peace." Silence again. Real silence. Even the younger woman shifted uncomfortably beside him now, because little by little, the emotional reality inside the room was changing shape. At first, the younger woman probably imagined Sharon as jealous, weak, emotional. Instead, she was witnessing something completely different. History, depth, partnership, the kind impossible to compete with using excitement alone. Mark reached for his wine again, though this time he barely drank any. His throat felt tight, because Sharon wasn't humiliating him loudly. She was exposing the version of him he abandoned, and somehow that felt worse. One investor's wife leaned forward carefully. "You helped him build a lot of this, didn't you?" Sharon looked genuinely surprised by the question. "A marriage usually builds things together," she replied softly. Mark closed his eyes briefly. That sentence alone nearly crushed him, because Sharon still spoke with dignity, even now. No bitterness, no public revenge, just honesty. And everyone at the table was beginning to compare her emotional maturity against his behavior. That comparison was not going well for him. The younger woman lowered her eyes toward her untouched plate again. Mark noticed. Panic flickered quietly inside him, for the first time all evening. Because suddenly, he could feel respect leaving the room, not loudly, quietly, like air disappearing from a space one breath at a time. A server arrived, carrying the next course. Nobody cared about the food anymore. The younger woman attempted a small smile toward Sharon. "You seem really strong," she said softly. Mark's chest tightened instantly. Sharon looked toward her calmly. "Not cold, not cruel, just honest. You become strong after spending enough time holding things together quietly." The younger woman swallowed slightly afterward, and for the first time that night, Mark realized she was starting to emotionally side with Sharon. That possibility never crossed his mind before, because he walked into this dinner believing attention automatically meant power. But attention without respect collapses quickly once reality enters the room. One businessman tried redirecting the conversation again. "Mark's company has become one of the fastest growing firms in Dallas." Sharon nodded proudly. "He worked very hard for that." Mark looked toward her immediately. That pride in her voice nearly broke him, because despite everything, part of Sharon still sounded sincere when discussing his accomplishments. That sincerity exposed how deeply she genuinely loved him once, maybe still did. And Mark suddenly hated himself for turning that love into public embarrassment. Sharon folded her napkin slowly before continuing. "I still remember decorating his first office," she said with a soft laugh. A few guests smiled politely. "It was terrible," she added. The carpet looked haunted. Even Mark let out a reluctant laugh under his breath. The younger woman glanced between them carefully now, probably noticing something painful. Sharon knew versions of Mark nobody else in that room ever would. Not the businessman, not the polished speaker, not the expensive watch. The real version, the insecure version, the exhausted version, the scared version. And Mark could feel everyone realizing that, too. "He almost bought this ridiculous metal sculpture for the lobby," Sharon continued. "Cost more than the actual furniture." A small laugh moved around the table. Mark rubbed his forehead quietly. "You never let that story die, because it was ugly." Another small wave of laughter. But underneath the humor, something devastating was happening emotionally. The room was remembering who they used to be together. Partners, friends, people who genuinely loved each other before ego complicated everything. The younger woman sat completely silent now, because she couldn't contribute to these memories. She only knew the version of Mark built from Expensive dinners, confidence, attention, status, excitement. Sharon knew the man beneath all of it, and Mark suddenly realized everybody could see the difference clearly. The older businessman leaned back thoughtfully. Funny how the people who help build success rarely get enough credit. Sharon smiled politely. That's marriage sometimes. Mark looked away immediately. Shame hit him hard enough now that maintaining eye contact became difficult, because deep down, he remembered everything too. The kitchen dancing, the Texas road trips, the nights Sharon sat beside him while he panicked over finances, the mornings she believed in him harder than he believed in himself. And now, he brought another woman to sit across from her publicly. The reality finally started sounding ugly even inside his own head. Sharon took another small sip of wine before speaking again. You know what's sad? She asked gently. Nobody answered. Some people spend years chasing success because they think it'll finally make them feel secure. Her eyes drifted toward Mark carefully. But insecurity doesn't disappear just because people admire you. The room became still again. Mark's chest tightened harder because Sharon wasn't guessing anymore. She understood him too well, too deeply. You can build companies, she continued softly. Buy luxury cars, wear expensive watches, sit in exclusive rooms. She paused briefly, and still feel terrified of becoming unimportant. Nobody moved, nobody interrupted. Even the servers slowed around the table now. Mark stared down at his hands, silently. The younger woman looked at him differently, for the first time. Not impressed, curious, almost uncertain, because Sharon had just exposed something emotionally vulnerable underneath his confidence. And suddenly Mark no longer looked powerful. He looked afraid. Sharon's voice stayed calm. That fear changes people if they aren't careful. Mark swallowed once. Across the room, one investor quietly shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably because parts of Sharon's words applied to more than just Mark. Some men start confusing admiration with love, Sharon said softly, because admiration feels exciting. Her gaze lowered briefly toward the candlelight. But excitement and loyalty are not the same thing. The younger woman's fingers tightened slightly around her wine glass. Mark noticed immediately. So did Sharon. Nobody at the table missed the emotional direction anymore. And still, Sharon never raised her voice once. That made the humiliation unbearable, because if she screamed, Mark could defend himself emotionally. But calm truth leaves nowhere to hide. Mark finally spoke after several painful seconds. Sharon. His voice sounded rougher than intended. She looked toward him quietly, and suddenly Mark forgot whatever defensive sentence he planned originally, because her eyes didn't look angry. That was the worst part. They looked disappointed, tired, like someone emotionally grieving something long before tonight. The younger woman glanced down again, clearly wishing she no longer sat at that table. Sharon rested her hands lightly together. I used to think loyalty naturally mattered more once people experienced real love, she admitted softly. But sometimes attention arrives at exactly the right moment to distract emotionally weak people. Mark flinched slightly. Not physically dramatic, but enough. Enough for everyone nearby to feel it. Then Sharon delivered the sentence that completely shattered whatever confidence he still carried into the room. Temporary attention can make a weak man forget permanent loyalty. The room went silent. Not socially silent, emotionally silent. The kind where nobody even reaches for water, because movement itself feels disrespectful. The younger woman stared at the table. Mark looked frozen, and every person sitting there understood exactly what happened in that moment. Sharon didn't embarrass herself tonight. Mark embarrassed himself. That realization finally crashed fully into him. Not because Sharon insulted him publicly, because she forced him to see himself honestly. And suddenly, all the expensive symbols around him felt meaningless. The watch, the tailored suit, the younger woman beside him. None of it looked impressive anymore. It looked empty. Worse, it looked insecure. Mark rubbed his hands together slowly beneath the table while trying to regain emotional control. But inside his chest, panic had already started spreading, because for the first time all evening, he realized something terrifying. He may have destroyed the only person who ever truly loved him before success changed him. Nobody touched the dessert. The plate sat untouched beneath candlelight, while quiet jazz continued drifting through the restaurant like the room hadn't emotionally collapsed in front of everyone. A server approached the table once, took one look at the atmosphere, then quietly disappeared again. Mark sat motionless beside the younger woman while Sharon remained calm across from him, fingers resting lightly against the stem of her wine glass. No one knew what to say anymore, because Sharon had already said the thing nobody in the room would forget. Temporary attention can make a weak man forget permanent loyalty. That sentence stayed hanging over the table like smoke, and Mark could feel every person there silently replaying it in their heads. The younger woman finally shifted in her chair uncomfortably before reaching for her purse. "I think maybe I should—" "No," Mark interrupted quickly. Too quickly. His voice cracked slightly beneath the pressure. That small crack embarrassed him immediately. The younger woman looked at him carefully now, not admiringly, not flirtatiously, just carefully, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. And honestly, that terrified Mark more than Sharon's words, because until tonight, he controlled the image everyone saw. Confident businessman, successful older man, desired, important. Now the image was falling apart publicly. One investor cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well," he muttered quietly, "it's getting late." Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to be the first person to leave either. Leaving would confirm the emotional destruction sitting openly at the table. Across from Mark, Sharon slowly reached for her wine one final time. Steady hand, steady breathing, no visible anger. And somehow, that emotional control continued crushing him more every second. Because, deep down, Mark finally understood something horrible. Sharon was no longer trying to save him from himself. That realization made the room suddenly feel smaller, warmer, harder to breathe inside. The younger woman looked toward Sharon carefully before speaking almost nervously. "I didn't know." Her voice faded quietly. Sharon turned toward her gently, and for the first time all evening, genuine sadness touched her expression. Not toward Mark, toward the younger woman, because Sharon finally saw what this really was. Not deep love, not emotional connection, validation, excitement, fantasy. The younger woman had been admiring a version of Mark built from polished surfaces, not the exhausted man Sharon held together emotionally for years. Sharon gave a small nod. "I know." That answer alone nearly shattered Mark, because Sharon still refused to become cruel even after public humiliation. The younger woman swallowed hard afterward. Her discomfort had fully transformed now. Earlier she walked into the restaurant feeling special. Now she looked emotionally trapped inside a situation bigger than she expected. Mark rubbed his jaw slowly while staring at the candlelight flickering across the table. His mind kept replaying memories he spent months emotionally avoiding. Sharon dancing barefoot in their kitchen. Late-night road trips across Texas. The tiny motel outside San Antonio. Her helping decorate his first office. Holding him during panic attacks he pretended were just stress. Believing in him before investors did, before money did, before anybody important knew his name. And now, all those memories sat beside the ugliest decision of his marriage. One woman near the far end of the table quietly stood first. "Well," she said softly, "I should probably head home." Another guest followed, then another, not dramatically, just slowly, like people escaping emotional wreckage politely. Nobody hugged Mark goodbye. Nobody joked with him. Nobody lingered around him warmly. That difference hit immediately, because these same people used to gravitate toward his energy naturally during business events. Tonight, they moved around him carefully. The younger woman noticed too, and for the first time since meeting Mark, she looked disappointed, not because he was married, because weakness suddenly replaced confidence. Sharon unfolded her napkin carefully before placing it beside her untouched dessert plate. The movement looked small, but Mark's stomach tightened instantly, because somewhere deep down, he knew what was coming. Sharon looked toward him calmly, not cold, not emotional, just finished, and that expression terrified him more than anything else tonight. "Sharon," Mark finally said quietly. She waited. For a second he almost told the truth. Not the polished version, not the defensive version, the real version, that he felt old lately. That admiration became addictive, because insecurity kept growing louder every year. That success never made him feel safe the way he expected. That part of him hated himself during every lie. But shame makes honest conversations difficult once damage becomes public. So instead, he said the weakest thing possible. "I didn't mean for this to happen like this." The second the words left his mouth, even he hated them, because this wasn't one accident. It was months of choices. Sharon stared at him quietly for several long seconds, then finally asked, "How exactly did you mean for it to happen?" No anger, no raised voice. That made the question devastating. Mark opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because there wasn't a good answer. There never was. The younger woman looked away completely now. Embarrassment spread visibly across her face. For the first time all evening, Mark realized she was emotionally withdrawing from him too, not dramatically, quietly, the same way Sharon had slowly withdrawn months earlier. One emotional step at a time. Sharon leaned back slightly in her chair. "You know what hurts the most?" she asked softly. Mark looked up. "It's not even the cheating." The table went still again. Mark's throat tightened. "It's realizing you stopped respecting me long before tonight." That sentence hit harder than anything else she said all evening, because deep down, it was true. Affairs rarely begin with attraction alone. They begin when respect inside a relationship starts collapsing quietly. Mark lowered his eyes toward the table, ashamed. Actually ashamed now. Not embarrassed. Ashamed. Sharon's voice softened slightly afterward. "I stood beside you when nobody was impressed by you yet." The younger woman's expression shifted immediately. Another painful realization. Sharon continued carefully. "I knew you before the expensive watches." Mark swallowed hard. Before the networking dinners, his chest tightened. Before the luxury image. The room felt suffocating now, because Sharon wasn't speaking like a bitter wife. She sounded like someone mourning the loss of a man she genuinely loved. And suddenly, the younger woman beside Mark looked emotionally insignificant compared to that history. Not worthless, just shallow in comparison. Sharon looked directly at Mark again. "I loved you long before anybody else admired you." The sentence landed like physical weight. Mark actually felt it in his chest, in his stomach, in the silence swallowing the room afterward, because for the first time all evening, he fully understood the difference between being admired and being deeply loved. Admiration fed his ego. Sharon fed his soul, and now he might lose her permanently. That realization finally cracked through every remaining layer of pride inside him. "Sharon," he said again, quieter this time. "Please." She looked at him calmly, and suddenly, Mark remembered something painful from years ago, a conversation during one of their Texas road trips. Sharon once told him, "A woman gets tired emotionally before she leaves physically." Back then he kissed her hand and promised, "I'll never give you a reason to leave." Now she sat across from him, already emotionally gone. Mark felt panic rising harder. Real panic. Not about public embarrassment. About loss. Actual loss. The younger woman slowly pushed her chair back from the table. "I should go," she said quietly. This time, Mark didn't stop her, because suddenly, he barely noticed her leaving. That terrified him too. Months of excitement, validation, attention. And now, none of it mattered compared to the possibility of Sharon walking away forever. The younger woman grabbed her purse carefully before standing. She looked toward Sharon one final time. "I'm sorry." Sharon nodded politely. Not dramatic forgiveness, just dignity. The younger woman left quietly afterward, without looking back again. And Mark finally understood something horrifying. The fantasy collapsed. The second real emotional consequences entered the room. Now he sat alone, facing the damage he created, across from the woman who once made him feel safe enough to stop performing. Sharon reached toward her left hand slowly. Mark's breath caught instantly, because he already knew. She twisted the wedding ring carefully beneath the candlelight, not angrily, almost thoughtfully. The diamond reflected softly, while she slid it from her finger. Mark stared at the ring, like it carried years inside it. Road trips, kitchen dancing, shared apartments, business failures, private jokes, late-night comfort, everything. Sharon placed the ring gently on the table between them. No dramatic speech, no crying, just quiet finality. And somehow, that hurt more than any scream possibly could. Mark felt his chest tighten painfully. "Don't do this," he whispered. Sharon looked at him with heartbreaking calmness. "I already did." Silence swallowed the room completely afterward. The remaining guests looked away respectfully now, because everybody understood they were witnessing the real ending of a marriage. Not because love disappeared, because respect did. Sharon stood slowly from her chair, smoothing the fabric of her dress carefully. Mark stood immediately too, panic visible now. "Sharon, please." She stopped him gently with one look, not hateful, tired. You spent so much time chasing people who made you feel important, she said softly. You stopped noticing the person who made you feel understood. Mark couldn't speak, couldn't defend himself, because every word would sound pathetic now. Sharon grabbed her purse calmly, then gave him one final look that nearly destroyed him emotionally. Not rage, not revenge, grief, the kind that comes after loving someone deeply and finally accepting they became someone else. Then she turned and walked away from the table with quiet dignity. No dramatic exit, no scene, just graceful distance growing with every step. Mark watched her disappear toward the elevator, feeling something inside him collapse completely. And suddenly, the restaurant felt terrifyingly quiet, because for the first time in years, silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt empty. One by one, the remaining guests left shortly afterward. Nobody stayed long enough to comfort Mark. Nobody defended him. Nobody admired him anymore. Eventually, the massive private dining room sat nearly empty, except for unfinished wine glasses and the wedding ring still resting beside the candlelight. Mark lowered himself slowly back into his chair. Alone, completely alone now. The city lights shimmered through the windows behind him while soft jazz continued playing somewhere in the background. And finally, after months of avoiding emotional truth, the silence terrified him. Mark got home after 2 a.m. The drive back from downtown Dallas felt longer than usual, not because traffic existed, because for the first time in years, he had nowhere emotionally safe waiting for him at the end of it. The wedding ring still sat inside his jacket pocket, heavy, colder than it should have felt. Mark parked slowly inside the driveway, before staring at the dark house through the windshield for several long seconds. Usually, Sharon left one kitchen light on whenever he came home late. Tonight, the entire place sat dark and still. That detail hit immediately. Small thing, painful thing. Mark finally stepped out of the truck and walked toward the front door, carrying silence behind him, like extra weight. The moment he entered the house, something felt wrong. Not physically wrong, emotionally empty. The air itself felt unfamiliar. No music softly playing from Sharon's phone somewhere upstairs. No candle scent drifting from the kitchen. No television murmuring in the background, while Sharon half-watched decorating shows she pretended not to be emotionally invested in. Just quiet. Mark loosened his tie slowly, while standing near the doorway. Sharon? No answer. Of course no answer. Still, hearing nothing made his chest tighten anyway. He walked toward the kitchen automatically. The same kitchen where they danced for years, where Sharon laughed at his expensive boots, where she sat beside him during business failures before anybody important cared who he was. Tonight the kitchen looked beautiful, perfect even, and completely lifeless. Mark rested one hand against the counter, while staring toward the empty space beside the stove, where Sharon usually stood cooking. A memory hit him instantly. Sharon swaying barefoot while stirring pasta sauce, laughing because he kept stepping on her feet, trying to dance. "You move like somebody fighting invisible bees," she once told him. Mark almost smiled remembering it. Almost. Then the smile disappeared just as fast, because memories hurt differently once you realize they're over. He walked upstairs slowly afterward. Every step inside the house sounded louder now. The bedroom door stood slightly open. Mark pushed it wider carefully. Half the closet was empty. His breathing stopped for a second. Not dramatically, just enough. Several dresses gone, shoes missing, jewelry case gone from the dresser. The realization moved through him quietly. Sharon didn't leave impulsively tonight. She prepared. That truth unsettled him deeply, because it meant she emotionally accepted losing him long before the dinner happened. Mark sat heavily at the edge of the bed while staring at the empty side of the closet. Months earlier, he probably would have assumed Sharon would never actually leave. Not Sharon. Not the woman who stayed during financial pressure. Not the woman who kept trying to reconnect. Not the woman who believed in marriage deeply enough to fight for it quietly. Now the empty closet exposed how badly he misunderstood her silence. It wasn't weakness. It was preparation. Mark rubbed both hands over his face slowly, then noticed something else. One framed photo missing from the nightstand. The picture from their Texas road trip near San Antonio. The cheap motel. The terrible coffee. The night Sharon laughed so hard she spilled wine across the blanket. She specifically took that photo. Not revenge. Memory. Meaning. Mark swallowed hard. Downstairs, the refrigerator hummed softly through the quiet house. The sound suddenly felt unbearable. He stood again and walked toward the bathroom. Her skincare products were gone too. The expensive lotions she joked about hiding from him, the perfumes, even her hairbrush disappeared. Tiny absences everywhere. And somehow those small missing things crushed him harder than the public humiliation. Because this house no longer carried Sharon's presence emotionally. It simply carried evidence she used to exist there. Mark barely slept that night. Around 4 a.m, he wandered back downstairs wearing sweatpants and exhaustion, while opening cabinets without purpose. The kitchen island still held the bowl Sharon always kept filled with fresh fruit, but even that looked staged now, like a house prepared for photographs instead of living. Mark grabbed a glass from the cabinet automatically before stopping halfway. Sharon always complained he reached for glasses near the top shelf, even though the clean ones sat directly in front of him. "You enjoy making life harder for yourself," she used to tease. The memory hit fast enough to physically hurt. Mark closed the cabinet again slowly, then stood motionless inside the kitchen, while grief finally settled completely into his chest. Not dramatic crying, something worse. Emptiness. Because for the first time since meeting Sharon, the house felt like a structure instead of a home. Morning arrived quietly, too quietly. Normally, Sharon played music while getting ready for work. Sometimes old soul songs. Sometimes terrible country music specifically to annoy him. Now the silence inside the house sounded unnatural. Mark sat alone at the dining table drinking coffee that tasted burned, because Sharon usually fixed it better than he did. His phone rested beside him. No message from her. No angry paragraphs. No emotional confrontation. Nothing. That absence terrified him more than yelling would have. Because emotionally detached people stop arguing once they're done hoping. Around noon, Mark finally walked back upstairs intending to shower. That's when he noticed the envelope resting neatly on the dresser, his name written carefully across the front. Mark's chest tightened immediately. He opened it slowly. Inside sat several documents: apartment lease agreement, interior design, business registration paperwork, bank statements, organized, prepared, thought through carefully. Mark stared at the papers in stunned silence. The dates crushed him. Some paperwork started months earlier, which meant Sharon began emotionally preparing her independence long before the dinner explosion. Not revenge, not manipulation, self-respect. That realization completely changed how he remembered recent months. Her emotional withdrawal, the calmer conversations, the way she stopped begging emotionally, the way she stopped asking where he was, constantly. Mark thought she was giving up temporarily. In reality, she was accepting reality, and somehow that truth hurt worse than betrayal itself, because Sharon didn't suddenly leave him. She slowly grieved the marriage, while still living inside it. Mark leaned heavily against the dresser, while looking around the half-empty bedroom. Suddenly, dozens of moments replayed differently inside his head. Sharon asking, "Are you still happy with me?" Sharon sitting awake alone downstairs drinking cold tea. Sharon saying, "I feel lonelier beside you than alone." At the time, Mark heard complaints. Now he heard warnings. Warnings he ignored, because attention outside the marriage felt easier than vulnerability inside it. His chest tightened painfully again. By evening, the house already started affecting him psychologically. Mark turned on the television twice, muted it both times, opened work emails, couldn't focus, walked into the kitchen repeatedly without hunger. At one point, he caught himself listening for Sharon's footsteps upstairs before remembering she wasn't there. That moment nearly broke him emotionally, because habits built through love don't disappear overnight. Around sunset, he wandered into the garage, searching for something meaningless, just to avoid sitting still. Instead, he found an old storage box shoved near the back wall. Inside, road trip photos, receipts from cheap diners, handwritten notes, Polaroids, tiny memories Sharon kept for sentimental reasons. Mark sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, flipping through them slowly. One photo showed Sharon laughing beside a gas station outside Houston while holding terrible coffee. Another showed Mark asleep during a road trip, with Sharon drawing fake eyebrows on him using eyeliner. At the bottom of the box sat a folded note written in Sharon's handwriting years earlier. "You make me feel safe enough to be fully myself." Mark closed his eyes immediately afterward, because suddenly the entire tragedy became painfully simple. Sharon gave him emotional safety, and he traded it for temporary validation. By nighttime, the silence inside the house no longer felt peaceful. It felt hostile. Every room carried reminders of her absence. The couch, where she fell asleep, reading. The kitchen where she danced. The bathroom mirror covered in sticky notes with random reminders. Even the air smelled different already. Mark stood alone near the bedroom window, staring out at the dark Dallas skyline, while the wedding ring remained clenched tightly in his hand. And finally, the truth hit completely. Sharon already accepted losing him long before he ever walked into that restaurant. 3 days passed before Mark heard from the younger woman again. Not because she was playing games, because neither of them really knew what existed between them anymore after the dinner. The illusion had cracked too badly. Mark sat alone in his office downtown when her message appeared across his phone screen. "You okay?" Such a simple question. Months earlier, that message probably would have excited him. Now, it mostly made him tired. Mark stared at the screen for several seconds before finally replying, "Yeah, just busy." Lie. He wasn't busy. He was emotionally drowning inside quiet rooms and memories he could no longer escape. Still, old habits answered automatically. That evening they met at a rooftop lounge overlooking downtown Dallas, the same kind of place that once made Mark feel powerful. Now, the city lights just looked cold. The younger woman arrived wearing another elegant black dress, though her energy felt different tonight, more careful, less impressed. Mark noticed immediately. "You look exhausted," she said softly after sitting down. Mark forced a small smile. "Long week." She studied him for a second. Normally, he filled silence quickly around her with confidence and charm. Tonight he looked emotionally older somehow, not physically, spiritually tired. A server placed drinks on the table before walking away. Neither touched them. The younger woman leaned back, slowly. "I didn't expect that dinner to happen like that." Mark rubbed his jaw quietly. "Neither did I." That wasn't fully true. Part of him absolutely expected emotional destruction. He just expected Sharon to become the unstable one publicly. Instead, she walked through humiliation with more dignity than anyone else in the room. That reality still haunted him. The younger woman glanced toward the skyline. "She really loved you." The sentence hit immediately. Mark looked down at the untouched drink in front of him. Yeah, no defense, no explanation, just truth. And suddenly the entire atmosphere between them changed. Because for the first time since meeting her, Mark stopped performing confidence. The younger woman noticed too. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Mark honestly didn't know. That terrified him, because all the excitement that once surrounded this relationship had disappeared the second real consequences arrived. Now there was just reality sitting between them, and reality looked emotionally thin. Their conversations suddenly felt different too. Months earlier, everything flowed easily. Flirting, admiration, playful teasing, expensive experiences. Now silence appeared more often, longer, heavier. The younger woman picked at the edge of her napkin absent-mindedly. "Can I ask you something, honestly?" Mark nodded once. "Did you actually want to leave your wife?" The question sat heavily between them. Mark opened his mouth, stopped, because deep down, he didn't know anymore. Or maybe he finally knew the truth and hated admitting it. He never planned emotionally beyond excitement. That realization embarrassed him deeply. The younger woman watched his hesitation carefully, and suddenly, she looked disappointed, not heartbroken, disappointed. Because immature relationships survive through fantasy. Once fantasy disappears, emotional emptiness becomes impossible to hide. Mark finally answered quietly, "I think I wanted to feel different." The younger woman frowned slightly. "Different? How?" "Younger." He exhaled slowly. "Important. Wanted." There it was. The truth underneath everything. Not love. Validation. The younger woman looked away afterward, and Mark could practically see her admiration fading in real time. Not because honesty made him unattractive, because insecurity did. That's the ugly thing about attention built around image. It disappears quickly once vulnerability replaces confidence. The younger woman crossed her arms lightly. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I thought you had everything figured out when I met you." Mark almost laughed. Instead, he stared down at the city lights below them. "So did I." The conversation struggled after that. Not hostile, empty. And for the first time, Mark noticed how little they actually knew about each other emotionally. She didn't know his childhood fears, why he hated disappointing people, how deeply his father shaped his insecurities, the panic attacks Sharon helped him through, the nights he questioned whether he was enough. And Mark realized something equally painful. He barely knew her either beyond attraction and excitement. The relationship never built emotional roots. It survived entirely on surface energy. That realization left him feeling strangely hollow. Eventually, the younger woman sighed softly. "I don't think you're really here with me tonight." Mark looked up slowly. She wasn't wrong, because emotionally he'd been sitting in that restaurant ever since Sharon removed the ring. The younger woman gave him a small, sad smile. "I think part of you is still sitting across from your wife." That sentence followed him all the way home afterward, especially once he walked back into the dark house again. The house hit differently every night now. The first evening felt shocking. The second felt lonely. By the third, the emptiness started feeling permanent. Mark dropped his keys onto the kitchen counter before instinctively glancing toward the stove. No Sharon. No music. No sarcastic comments about his terrible eating habits. He opened the refrigerator. Nothing inside looked familiar anymore, because Sharon usually organized everything with strange, emotional precision. Sauces grouped together. Fruit separated carefully. Leftovers labeled. Now the shelves looked cold and disorganized, because Mark stopped caring after she left. He grabbed water absent-mindedly before noticing her handwriting still attached to one container. "Eat this before Thursday." The note nearly crushed him, because Sharon had been caring for him, even while emotionally preparing to leave him. Mark sat alone at the kitchen island afterward, staring at the note for several minutes, then finally laughed once bitterly under his breath. Not humor, self-disgust, because the contrast between the two women now looked painfully obvious. One admired his lifestyle. The other built a life with him. One made him feel exciting. The other made him feel understood. And somehow he confused those things long enough to destroy his marriage. Days later, Mark tried distracting himself through work again. Long office hours, networking meetings, gym sessions, business calls. None of it worked anymore, because every version of success suddenly felt emotionally empty, without Sharon there to share it with. One afternoon, he stood inside his downtown office, staring at the skyline through massive glass windows. Years ago, Sharon helped decorate this exact space. Warm lighting, artwork, plants, furniture softening the cold modern design. At the time, he barely appreciated how much emotional life she brought into empty rooms. Now he noticed her fingerprints everywhere. Even absence started looking like Sharon. That realization became unbearable. Later that week, Mark drove aimlessly through Texas for hours without destination. Past highways they once traveled together. Roadside diner, gas stations, tiny towns carrying memories he spent years taking for granted. Eventually, he stopped outside the old motel near San Antonio, where they once danced badly beside a broken air conditioner while laughing over cheap wine. The motel looked exactly the same. Faded sign, weak lighting, tiny parking spaces. Mark sat inside the truck staring at it quietly. A memory hit him hard enough to physically ache. Sharon laying across the bed laughing because he tried singing country music dramatically while holding a hairbrush like a microphone. "You are emotionally embarrassing," she told him between laughs. Mark remembered kissing her forehead afterward. Remembered feeling genuinely happy. Not admired, happy. The difference suddenly devastated him, because admiration always required performance. Sharon loved him during unguarded moments. Messy moments, exhausted moments, real moments. Mark rested both hands against the steering wheel, while emotion tightened painfully in his chest. For months, he chased excitement, believing peace had become boring. Now he understood something terrible. Peace only feels boring to people who don't realize how rare it actually is. By nighttime, Mark found himself parked outside the Houston neighborhood, where Sharon's family used to host cookouts years earlier. He didn't get out, didn't call anyone, just sat there remembering. The music, the dancing, the aunties roasting his expensive clothes, Sharon laughing, while pulling him into conversations he initially felt awkward inside. Back then, he felt emotionally alive there, not because anybody admired him, because people genuinely accepted him. And now, all those memories felt painfully distant. Mark leaned back against the seat, staring through the windshield, while regret settled deeper inside him than ever before. Not dramatic regret, not movie scene regret, the quieter kind, The kind that arrives slowly once somebody finally understands what they destroyed with their own hands. And suddenly every place connected to Sharon felt emotionally haunted by who they used to be together. 6 months later, Dallas felt different to Mark. Not because the city changed, because he had. The attention still existed. Business success still existed. Money still existed, but none of it distracted him anymore. That was the cruelest part about regret. Sometimes clarity arrives only after destruction finishes its work. Mark still lived in the same modern house, overlooking the quiet neighborhood outside the city. Still drove the same luxury truck. Still attended meetings inside expensive restaurants, where businessmen talked loudly about expansion and status, like those things guaranteed fulfillment. But now Mark noticed something he ignored for years. Most people in those rooms looked emotionally exhausted, performing confidence, performing success, performing importance. And for the first time in his life, Mark no longer envied it. The younger woman disappeared from his life, naturally after the dinner. No dramatic breakup, no screaming match, just emotional collapse once reality replaced fantasy completely. Their final conversation happened over coffee nearly 2 months earlier. She sat across from him quietly before finally admitting, "You never actually wanted me. You wanted the version of yourself you became around me." At the time, the sentence hurt. Later, Mark realized she was right. Neither of them were villains, just emotionally immature in different ways. The relationship had no foundation strong enough to survive consequences. No shared history, no sacrifice, no emotional depth, just excitement mistaken for meaning. And excitement fades quickly once guilt enters the room. Mark rarely thought about her anymore, not because she never mattered, because Sharon never stopped mattering more. That truth followed him everywhere now, especially inside ordinary moments. The grocery store, empty mornings, long drives, quiet dinners. Every small part of life reminded him what genuine partnership actually looked like once it disappeared. One Friday evening, Mark stood inside his kitchen, attempting to cook for himself. The attempt went badly almost immediately. Smoke drifted lightly from the pan, while he stared at it with exhausted irritation. Sharon used to laugh whenever he cooked, because he approached food the same way he approached business, aggressively, impatiently, overconfident. "You season chicken like you're declaring war," she once told him. Mark smiled despite himself remembering it. Then the smile faded slowly, because memories stopped feeling warm lately. Now they mostly hurt. The kitchen still looked beautiful. Sharon's influence remained everywhere. The lighting, the colors, the small details making the house feel emotionally alive. Mark finally understood something painful. He built structures. Sharon built environments people emotionally wanted to stay inside. That difference mattered far more than he appreciated, while she stood beside him. Later that night, Mark sat alone on the back patio holding untouched whiskey, while rain tapped softly against the roof overhead. His phone rested beside him. No messages, no distractions, just stillness. Months earlier, silence terrified him because it forced self-reflection. Now he almost welcomed it, because running from truth exhausted him more than facing it finally did. The strange thing, Mark genuinely changed after Sharon left. Not performative change, not temporary guilt, real change. Therapy, less drinking, fewer meaningless networking events, more honesty with himself. For the first time in decades, he started unpacking the emotional damage inherited from the men who raised him. The obsession with appearing powerful, the fear of aging, the need for admiration, the inability to sit quietly inside vulnerability. But personal growth arrived too late to save the marriage. That became the hardest lesson of all. One afternoon, Mark received news from a mutual business contact that Sharon's interior styling company was doing extremely well in Houston. The information hit him unexpectedly hard, not because he wanted her struggling, because part of him always underestimated how prepared she already was emotionally before leaving. Now he understood. Sharon didn't suddenly become strong after the dinner. She became strong during the lonely months before it. While he chased attention, she quietly rebuilt herself. That realization filled him with equal parts admiration and grief. A few weeks later, Mark traveled to Houston for business meetings. Normally, he would have avoided areas connected to Sharon. This time he didn't. Maybe part of him wanted the pain. Or maybe he simply missed feeling close to her somehow. After meetings ended early one evening, Mark drove slowly through familiar streets, while memories followed him through every neighborhood, the cookouts, the dancing, the loud family laughter, the emotional warmth completely different from his own upbringing. Sharon once told him, people should feel loved inside a home, not just impressed by it. Back then, he kissed her forehead and agreed casually. Now the sentence felt devastatingly wise. At a stoplight near downtown Houston, Mark noticed a small crowd gathered outside an interior design event space, glowing warmly against the evening sky. Music floated softly through the open entrance, elegant lighting, beautiful staging. Mark almost kept driving. Then he saw Sharon. For a second, his chest physically tightened. She stood near the entrance speaking with guests, while wearing a cream-colored dress and the same calm confidence she carried the night she left him. But something about her looked different now, lighter, not happier exactly, freer, the kind of freedom people carry after surviving emotional disappointment and finally choosing themselves afterward. Mark stayed inside the truck, watching quietly from across the street. Sharon laughed at something one guest said before adjusting a decorative arrangement near the doorway. Small movement, familiar movement. And suddenly Mark remembered all the tiny things he once overlooked while chasing validation elsewhere. The way she fixed crooked picture frames automatically. The way she touched people gently during conversations. The way she turned ordinary spaces into emotional experiences. For a dangerous second, Mark almost stepped out of the truck, almost crossed the street, almost interrupted her evening, just to hear her voice again. But deep down, he knew that moment no longer belonged to him. Sharon looked peaceful, not waiting, not hoping, not emotionally tied to the past anymore. And Mark finally respected her enough not to disturb that peace. The light changed. Cars moved around him slowly. Still, Mark stayed parked there, another minute just watching quietly. Then Sharon glanced briefly toward the street. Their eyes met. The world seemed to stop for one painful second. No anger crossed her face, no bitterness, just recognition, history, a life they once built together. Mark gave the smallest nod. Sharon looked at him for a long moment. Then something gentle softened in her expression. Not romantic hope, not invitation, acceptance. The kind people reach after grieving fully. Then another guest approached her, and Sharon turned naturally back toward the event. Conversation resumed. Laughter resumed. Life resumed. Without him, Mark sat motionless inside the truck, while emotion pressed heavily against his chest. Because finally, completely, he understood the full weight of what he lost. Not just a wife, not just companionship. He lost the only person who ever loved him before success made him impressive to strangers. And some losses don't return, no matter how deeply regret arrives afterward. Mark drove back toward Dallas later that night beneath endless Texas highway lights, while memories kept surfacing one after another. Kitchen dancing, road trips, cheap wine, late-night conversations, her laughter filling quiet rooms, the way she believed in him before money convinced other people to. By the time the city skyline appeared again, Mark no longer blamed Sharon for leaving. Honestly, he was grateful she loved herself enough to, because staying would have destroyed her slowly. And for the first time in his life, Mark finally understood the difference between being admired and being truly known. One feeds ego, the other feeds the soul. He arrived home after midnight and stood alone inside the silent kitchen for several long seconds. The house remained beautiful, still perfectly designed, still carrying traces of Sharon everywhere. But now, the silence no longer felt frightening. It felt deserved. Mark rested one hand against the kitchen counter, while staring into the dark reflection of the windows. And finally, after everything, the attention, the ego, the lies, the humiliation, the loneliness, the regret, the truth became painfully simple. Mark spent years building luxury homes for strangers and still lost the only person who ever made one feel like home. Some people don't realize what they had until silence replaces it. If this story meant something to you, like, share, and subscribe to Mr. George Stories.